I was 8 years old when my parents told me to wait in that cold garage while they ran an errand. I waited for 6 hours before I understood the truth: they weren't coming back. The man who found me shivering on that concrete floor was a stranger named Henry Collins, a poor mechanic who could barely afford his own meals. But he took me in anyway. He gave me everything he had worked himself to exhaustion and taught me that kindness was the only currency that truly mattered. 27 years later, I built a tech company worth millions. I thought I'd finally made Henry proud. I thought we were safe. Then my birth parents walked back into my life. Not with apologies, not with shame, with a lawsuit. They claimed Henry kidnapped me, that the $3.8 million he left me was stolen. They wanted every penny, and they wanted to destroy the memory of the only father I ever knew. The pressure killed him. Henry died with their accusations hanging over his head. His name dragged through the mud by the same people who abandoned me like trash. In court, I was losing. Their lawyers were too good, their lies too polished. The judge was about to rule in their favor. And then a billionaire walked into that courtroom. What he revealed didn't just save my case, it exposed a pattern of cruelty so twisted, so calculated, that my parents' perfect masks shattered in front of everyone. By the time I was done, they didn't just lose the money. They lost everything. This is how I made them pay. My name is Taylor Burke, and I'm 35 years old now, a tech entrepreneur who built a multi-million-dollar company from nothing. But before I became the woman you might read about in business magazines, before I had any success or stability or sense of who I was just an 8-year-old girl sitting on the frozen concrete floor of an abandoned garage, waiting for parents who would never come back. Let me take you back to that morning, the day everything changed. It was March 15th, 1998. I remember the date because it was supposed to be special. My mother had promised we'd go shopping for my birthday, which was coming up in 2 weeks. I was excited, dressed in my favorite purple sweater, even though it had a small hole in the sleeve. I didn't have many clothes, and the ones I did have were worn thin from too many washes and hand-me-downs that never quite fit right. The car ride that morning felt wrong from the start. My parents didn't talk to each other. My father's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, and my mother stared out the window with her jaw clenched. I sat in the back seat trying to be as quiet and small as possible. I'd learned early that when the air between them felt like this thick and sharp and ready to break, the best thing I could do was disappear into myself. We pulled up to an old garage on the outskirts of town. The building looked forgotten, with peeling paint and broken windows covered in grime. My father turned off the engine but didn't get out right away. My mother twisted in her seat to look at me, and for just a second, I thought I saw something like sadness in her eyes. But it was gone so quickly I convinced myself I'd imagined it. "Taylor," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. "We need you to wait here for just a minute. We have to take care of something. Stay right here and don't move. Do you understand?" I nodded because that's what good girls did. They listened. They obeyed. They didn't ask questions. My parents got out of the car and walked a few feet away. I watched through the window as they stood close together, their voices low and urgent. My father gestured sharply with his hands. My mother shook her head, then nodded, then covered her face. I pressed my nose against the cold glass, trying to understand what was happening. Then they got back in the car into the front seats, and my father started the engine. "Wait here, Taylor," my mother said again, not looking at me. "Someone will come get you soon." Before I could respond, before I could ask where they were going or why I couldn't come with them, they drove away. I watched our old sedan disappear down the road, a cloud of exhaust trailing behind it like a ghost. At first, I thought they really would come back in a minute. Maybe they needed gas. Maybe they forgot something at home. I waited in the spot where they'd left me, right outside the garage entrance, sitting on the cold concrete, because there was nowhere else to go. The wind cut through my thin purple sweater, and I wrapped my arms around myself, shivering. Minutes turned into an hour, then 2 hours, then more. I watched cars drive past on the main road. Some slowed down, the drivers glancing at me with mild curiosity before speeding up again. No one stopped. A few people walked by, a man in a business suit talking loudly on his cell phone, a woman pushing a stroller, a teenager with headphones bobbing his head to music I couldn't hear. I wanted to call out to them to ask if they'd seen my parents, but fear kept my voice locked in my throat. What if I was wrong? What if my parents came back and were angry that I'd talked to strangers? My mother always said, "Good girls wait quietly." So I waited quietly, even as the sun moved across the sky and the shadows grew longer, and the cold seeped deeper into my bones. As the afternoon faded into evening, a terrible understanding began to settle over me. It started as a whisper in the back of my mind, a thought I tried desperately to push away. They're not coming back. I was 8 years old, but I wasn't stupid. I'd heard them fighting late at night when they thought I was asleep. I'd heard my mother say, "I can't do this anymore." I'd heard my father respond, "Then we'll figure something out." I just never imagined that something meant leaving me behind like an old piece of furniture they didn't want anymore. The realization hit me like a physical blow. My chest tightened and it became hard to breathe. I wanted to cry, but I was too scared. Crying meant admitting this was real. Crying meant accepting that I was alone. I tried to remember everything my mother had taught me about being good. Sit still. Don't make noise. Don't bother people. Wait quietly. So I sat there on that freezing concrete, my body shaking from cold and fear, and I waited because I didn't know what else to do. The world felt enormous and hostile around me. Every sound made me jump, a car backfiring, a dog barking in the distance, the rattle of a chain-link fence in the wind. I pulled my knees up to my chest and wrapped my arms around them, trying to make myself as small as possible. Maybe if I was small enough, I wouldn't be so scared. Maybe if I was small enough, my parents would realize they'd made a mistake and come back for me. But they didn't come back. At some point, a man emerged from inside the garage. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with grease-stained overalls and a tired expression. He noticed me sitting there, and for one hopeful moment, I thought he might help. Our eyes met across the distance. I tried to find my voice to ask him if he'd seen my parents, but before I could speak, he looked away and walked in the opposite direction. He'd seen me. I knew he had. But he chose to walk away anyway. That's when I understood something that would stay with me for the rest of my life. I was invisible. Not just to my parents, but to everyone. I was a problem. People didn't want to deal with a complication they could avoid by simply looking the other way. I wrapped my arms tighter around myself and wondered what I'd done wrong. Had I been too loud, too demanding, not good enough? The questions swirled in my mind, each one cutting deeper than the last. 8-year-old children believe the world revolves around them, that everything that happens is somehow their fault. So I sat there in that cold garage, convinced that I'd driven my own parents away, that I deserved to be abandoned. The sun was almost gone now, the sky turning deep shades of purple and orange. Soon it would be completely dark and I'd be alone in the shadows. The thought terrified me. I closed my eyes and tried to remember my mother's face, my father's voice, anything that would make me feel less alone. But their faces were already starting to blur in my memory like photographs left too long in the sun. I don't know how long I sat there. Time stopped meaning anything. All I knew was cold and fear and the crushing weight of being unwanted. Then, just as the last light was fading from the sky, a shadow fell across me. I looked up. My vision blurred with unshed tears and saw a figure standing there. For one wild, desperate moment, I thought it was my father, that he'd come back, that this had all been some terrible mistake. But it wasn't my father. It was a stranger. A man I'd never seen before, with kind eyes and work-worn hands. He knelt down to my level, and his voice was the gentlest thing I'd heard all day. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" I looked up at the stranger through tears I'd been holding back all day, and something in his expression made me believe just for a moment that maybe someone actually cared. He had a weathered face, the kind that comes from years of hard work and honest living. His hands were stained with grease, and his work shirt had a patch on the pocket that read, "Henry," in faded red thread. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" he asked again, his voice so gentle it almost hurt to hear. I opened my mouth to answer, but all that came out was a choked sob. The question itself, someone asking if I was okay, broke something inside me that had been holding firm all day. Nobody had asked me that, not the people who walked past, not the man from the garage who pretended not to see me, certainly not my parents before they drove away. When I started crying, Henry didn't rush forward to comfort me. He didn't try to touch me or pick me up. He just stayed there, kneeling on the cold concrete at my level, waiting with infinite patience. His eyes were kind, but there was something else in them too, a deep sadness, like he understood exactly what I was feeling. "It's okay to cry," he said softly. "You've had a hard day, haven't you?" I nodded, wiping my face with my sleeve. My whole body was shaking now from both the cold and the relief of finally not being alone. Henry slowly reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a clean handkerchief, offering it to me without coming any closer. I took it with trembling hands and pressed it against my face. "Can you tell me your name?" he asked. "Taylor," I whispered. "Taylor Burke." "That's a beautiful name. I'm Henry Collins. Do you know where your parents are, Taylor?" The question made me flinch. Henry noticed immediately and held up his hands in a calming gesture. "It's okay," he said. "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to. But I need you to know something important. You're safe now. I'm not going to leave you here alone. Do you understand?" I looked into his eyes, searching for any sign that he was lying, that he would walk away like everyone else. But all I saw was genuine concern. Finally, I whispered the truth I'd been trying not to admit to myself. "My parents said they'd come back, but I don't think they will." I watched as tears filled Henry's eyes. He blinked them away quickly, but not before I saw them. A grown man was crying because of what happened to me. That simple fact told me more about Henry Collins than words ever could. He cared. He actually cared. "How long have you been here?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Since this morning, when it was still cold and dark." Henry's jaw tightened and he looked away for a moment, composing himself. When he turned back to me, his expression was resolute. "Okay, Taylor, here's what we're going to do. First, we're going to call the police and let them know you're here. Then I'm going to take you somewhere warm where you can get some food. Does that sound all right?" I nodded, relief flooding through me. Henry stood up and pulled out a cell phone, stepping a few feet away to make the call. I watched as he explained the situation to whoever was on the other end, his voice growing increasingly frustrated. He kept glancing back at me, as if to make sure I was still there, that I hadn't disappeared. After several minutes, he hung up and came back to me, his expression troubled. "The police say they can't do anything right now," he said, and I could hear the anger barely contained in his voice. "There's no missing person report filed. They said if your parents do show up looking for you, to have them call the station. But they're not sending anyone out here tonight." The words confused me. How could the police not help? Wasn't that their job? Henry seemed to read my thoughts. "I know it doesn't make sense, sweetheart, but the system doesn't always work the way it should. The important thing is that you're not going to spend the night out here in the cold. Come on, let's get you somewhere safe." He offered me his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, I took it. His palm was rough and calloused from years of mechanical work, but his grip was gentle. He led me to an old pickup truck parked nearby and helped me into the passenger seat, making sure I was buckled in securely. As we drove through the darkening streets, I stared out the window at the world passing by, feeling like I was floating in some strange dream. Henry took me to a mobile home park on the edge of town. His home was small and simple, just a few rooms cluttered with tools and car parts and stacks of books. But it was warm and clean, and the moment we stepped inside, I felt something I hadn't felt in my own house for as long as I could remember. Welcome. "Are you hungry?" Henry asked, already moving toward the small kitchen. I was just about to make some dinner. How about soup and grilled cheese sandwiches? I nodded, not trusting my voice. I sat at the tiny kitchen table and watched as Henry moved around his kitchen with practiced efficiency. He heated up tomato soup and made 2 perfect grilled cheese sandwiches, the cheese melting out the sides just right. When he set the plate in front of me, the smell alone was enough to make my stomach growl loudly. Henry smiled at the sound. Well, that answers that question. Go ahead, eat as much as you want. I ate slowly at first, worried he might take the food away if I was too eager. But Henry just sat across from me with his own meal, eating quietly and giving me space. When I finished everything on my plate, he asked if I wanted more. I did, and he gave it to me without hesitation, without making me feel guilty for being hungry. After dinner, Henry found some clothes for me, an old t-shirt that hung down to my knees, and some sweatpants with a drawstring I had to tie tight to keep them from falling down. They were clean and soft and smelled like laundry detergent. He showed me to his bedroom and started changing the sheets. "You'll sleep here tonight," he said. "I'll take the couch. The bathroom is right through there if you need it." "Where will you sleep?" I asked, my voice small. "The couch is just fine for me. I fall asleep there half the time anyway." He smiled at me, and I could see the kindness radiating from him like warmth from a fire. As I climbed into the bed, Henry tucked the blankets around me, something my own mother had never done. He asked if I was warm enough, if I needed anything, if I was comfortable. Every question felt like a small miracle because they meant someone was thinking about me, caring about whether I was okay. "Henry," I said as he was about to turn off the light. "Yeah, sweetheart. Thank you for not walking away." His eyes glistened in the dim light. "I could never walk away from a child who needed help. Never. You get some rest now, okay? I'll be right out in the living room if you need anything at all." That night, lying in a warm bed with a full stomach for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt something shift inside me. Maybe not all adults were cruel. Maybe not everyone would abandon me. Maybe, just maybe, I'd been found by someone who actually gave a damn whether I lived or died. I fell asleep to the sound of Henry making phone calls in the other room, still trying to find someone, anyone in the system who would help. His determination to do right by me, this stranger child who'd been thrown away like garbage, was the first real kindness I'd ever known. 3 days later, a social worker finally came to Henry's mobile home. She interviewed both of us, took notes, made more phone calls. Then she turned to Henry with a question that would change both of our lives forever. "Mr. Collins, would you be willing to become her temporary guardian?" Henry looked at the social worker for a long moment, and I held my breath without realizing it. I'd been in his home for 3 days, and already the thought of leaving made my chest tight with panic. I'd started to feel safe here. I'd started to believe that maybe things could be different. "Yes," Henry said quietly, his voice steady and sure. "I would be honored to be her guardian." The social worker smiled and began explaining the paperwork, the requirements, the home visits that would happen periodically. Henry listened carefully, nodding at all the right moments, asking questions when he didn't understand something. I sat on the couch, clutching a pillow to my chest, watching this stranger who'd already shown me more kindness than my own parents ever had, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. The weeks that followed were a blur of adjustments and small miracles. Henry worked at the garage during the day, fixing cars and barely making enough to cover his own bills. But he never once made me feel like I was a financial burden. Instead, he picked up extra shifts, night work that paid a little more, but left him exhausted and worn. I didn't understand the full extent of his sacrifice then. I was just a child who needed stability, and Henry was determined to provide it. He took me shopping for clothes at the thrift store, letting me pick out things I actually liked instead of just whatever was cheapest. He enrolled me in school and showed up to every parent-teacher conference, even when it meant losing hours at work. He attended parenting classes offered by social services every Tuesday evening, coming home with pamphlets and handouts that he'd study like they were the most important documents in the world. One Saturday morning, I came into the living room to find Henry sitting on the floor with his laptop balanced on the coffee table, watching a YouTube video with intense concentration. On the screen, a woman was demonstrating how to braid hair. Henry had a hairbrush and some elastics laid out beside him, practicing on a section of rope. "What are you doing?" I asked, curious. He looked up, slightly embarrassed but smiling. "Well, I noticed the other girls at your school have their hair done all pretty, and I thought maybe you'd like that too. Problem is, I've never braided anything in my life. But the internet says I can learn, so that's what I'm doing." My throat tightened with emotion. My own mother had never bothered to do my hair. She'd always said she didn't have time, that I was old enough to do it myself. But here was Henry, a man who'd known me for less than a month, sitting on his living room floor trying to learn how to braid hair because he thought it would make me happy. "Can you try on me?" I asked softly. His face lit up. "Really? You sure I'm not very good yet?" "I don't mind." I sat on the floor in front of him, and Henry carefully brushed my hair, his touch gentle and patient. His first attempt at a braid was crooked and loose, falling apart almost immediately. But he tried again, and again. By the fourth try, he'd managed something that actually looked like a braid, even if it wasn't perfect. "How's that?" he asked, holding up a small mirror so I could see. I looked at my reflection and saw a girl who was cared for. A girl whose guardian took the time to learn something new just to make her feel special. Tears welled up in my eyes. "It's perfect," I whispered. Still, I was scared. Deeply, fundamentally scared that this wouldn't last. Every night I waited for the moment when Henry would decide I was too much trouble and send me away. I tested him in small ways, being difficult about homework, taking too long in the bathroom, leaving my things scattered around. I was waiting for him to snap, to yell, to show his true colors. But he never did. When I had nightmares about the garage, about being left alone in the cold, Henry would hear me crying and come into the room. He'd sit in the chair beside my bed, sometimes reading to me from one of his books, sometimes just sitting there in comfortable silence until I fell back asleep. He never made me feel weak for being afraid. He never told me to just get over it. He left a nightlight on in my room without me having to ask, because he'd noticed I was afraid of the dark. He learned what foods I liked and which ones I didn't. He remembered that I preferred grape juice to apple juice, that I liked my toast lightly buttered, that I hated the sound of the vacuum cleaner. These tiny details that my own parents had never bothered to learn, Henry absorbed and remembered. Slowly, cautiously, I began to trust him. I started talking more at dinner, telling him about my day at school. I started smiling when he made terrible dad jokes. I started to believe that this might actually be real, that I might have found someone who wouldn't leave. One afternoon, about 2 months after I'd moved in, I noticed something on Henry's wall that I hadn't paid attention to before. Next to a recent photo of the two of us at the park, there was an empty picture frame. It was the same size and style as the one holding our photo, but there was nothing inside it, just the backing board waiting for an image that had never been placed there. "Henry," I asked, pointing at it, "why is that frame empty?" His expression shifted immediately, a shadow passing over his face. He looked at the frame with such profound sadness that I almost wished I hadn't asked. "That frame belonged to someone I loved very much," he said quietly. "Someone I lost a long time ago." "Who?" I asked, my child's curiosity overriding my sensitivity. Henry was quiet for a moment, his jaw working as if he was trying to decide how much to tell me. Finally he said, "Someone I hope to find again someday. But until then, I keep the frame there as a reminder." I didn't understand what he meant. Not really. But I understood sadness. I understood loss. And I understood that Henry carried pain inside him, just like I did. Maybe that's why he understood me so well. Maybe that's why he'd been the one to stop when everyone else walked by. The empty frame stayed on the wall, a silent witness to something I was too young to comprehend. But I'd remember it. Years later, when I finally learned about Evan, about the son Henry had lost to poverty and a cruel legal system, I would understand that empty frame represented a father's endless hope, a love that refused to die even when everything else had been taken away. As weeks turned into months, the mobile home that had felt temporary began to feel permanent. I started calling it home. I started feeling like I belonged somewhere. And one quiet evening, as Henry was helping me with my math homework, the word slipped out before I could stop it. "Dad," I said, looking up from my worksheet, "can you help me with this problem?" The moment the word left my mouth, I froze. Henry's pen stopped moving. The silence stretched between us, heavy with meaning. I'd called him Dad. I hadn't meant to, or maybe I had, and I just hadn't realized it until the word was already out there. Henry's eyes were shining with tears when he looked at me. "Yeah, sweetheart," Henry said softly, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "I can help you with that problem." We never talked about the fact that I'd called him Dad. We didn't need to. From that moment on, it was simply understood. Henry was my father in every way that mattered, and I was his daughter. The word had made it official, but the reality had been building for months. What I didn't understand then, what I was too young to fully grasp, was just how much Henry was sacrificing to give me the life I deserved. I knew we didn't have much money. I knew our home was small and our meals were simple. But I didn't realize that Henry was slowly destroying himself to make sure I had everything I needed. He'd always worked at the garage during the day, but about 6 months after I came to live with him, he took on a second job delivering packages at night. He'd come home around 6 in the evening, make us dinner, help me with homework, and then leave again at 8 to drive routes until 2 or 3 in the morning. I'd hear him come in late, the door closing softly so he wouldn't wake me, and I'd listen to him move quietly through the mobile home before finally collapsing on the couch. In the morning, he'd be up again at 6, making my breakfast and packing my lunch before driving me to school and heading straight to the garage. I don't know when he slept. I don't think he did, not really. Maybe he caught an hour or two between jobs, maybe he dozed off during his lunch break. But he never complained. He never made me feel like I was the reason for his exhaustion. Every evening when he came home for that brief window between jobs, Henry would ask me about my day at school. He wanted to know everything, what I learned, who I played with at recess, whether I liked the book we were reading in English class. His hands would be stained with grease and motor oil, his shoulders would sag with fatigue, but his attention was always fully on me. Those conversations were sacred to him, I realized later. They were the reason he worked himself to the bone. I started noticing small things as I grew older. The way Henry would serve me dinner and then claim he'd already eaten even though I'd never seen him eat. The way he'd give me seconds when I was still hungry, saying he was full after just a few bites. I didn't question it at first because I was a child and children accept what adults tell them. But as the months passed and I became more observant, I began to understand that Henry was going without so I could have enough. His clothes became more worn, the fabric thin at the elbows and knees, while I got new school clothes every season. He wore the same pair of work boots for years. The leather cracked and the soles held together with glue, but my shoes were always replaced the moment they got too small. When the heater broke one winter, Henry fixed it immediately, working late into the night, even though he had to be up early the next morning because he couldn't stand the thought of me being cold. I remember the day I found the medical bills. I was 11 years old, looking for a pen in Henry's desk drawer when I found a stack of envelopes marked "Final Notice" in angry red letters. They were bills from a cardiologist, prescriptions that hadn't been filled, appointment reminders for visits Henry had never kept. My hands shook as I looked through them, understanding dawning with horrible clarity. Henry had a heart condition. He needed medication, and he wasn't taking it. That evening I watched him differently. I saw the way he'd wince and press his hand to his chest when he thought I wasn't looking. I saw how he'd pause sometimes, breathing carefully before continuing whatever task he was working on. I saw the way exhaustion had carved lines into his face that hadn't been there when we first met. "Dad," I said that night at dinner, my voice small. "Are you okay?" He looked up, surprised by the question. Of course, sweetheart. Why do you ask? You just look tired. Henry smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. I'm fine, Taylor. Just a long day at work. Nothing to worry about. But I did worry. I worried constantly, though I didn't know how to express it or what to do about it. I was just a child powerless to change our circumstances, watching the man who'd saved me slowly wear himself down to nothing. Henry's lessons during those years shaped me in ways I wouldn't fully appreciate until I was an adult. He taught me that kindness is never wasted, that treating people with dignity costs nothing but means everything. I watched him live those values every single day. When our neighbor Mr. Patterson made cruel comments about us being poor, about Henry raising someone else's kid, Henry never responded with anger. He just nodded politely and said, "Have a good day, sir." Later, when Mr. Patterson's car broke down, Henry fixed it for free. I asked him why he'd help someone who'd been so mean to us, and Henry said, "Because his cruelty is his problem, not mine. I won't let his ugliness change who I am." When a customer at the garage tried to cheat Henry, claiming work hadn't been done, that Henry had clearly completed, Henry didn't argue or make a scene. He just calmly showed the customer the records, explained what had been done, and when the customer still refused to pay, Henry let it go. "Some battles aren't worth fighting," he told me. "Integrity matters more than being right." These lessons accumulated like stones, building a foundation. Henry was teaching me how to be a good person, not through lectures or punishment, but through example. He showed me that strength wasn't about revenge or retaliation. It was about maintaining your principles even when the world gave you every reason to abandon them. One night when I was 12, I woke up thirsty and went to the kitchen for water. I heard Henry's voice coming from the living room, low and strained. He was on the phone with a bill collector, explaining in that patient, exhausted tone that he would pay as soon as he could, that he just needed a little more time. I stood in the hallway, frozen, listening to him promise money he didn't have to someone who didn't care about his circumstances. When he hung up, I peeked around the corner and saw him sitting in the darkness, his head in his hands. He looked defeated in a way I'd never seen before. His shoulders were slumped, his breathing uneven. For the first time, I saw Henry not as the invincible father who could fix anything, but as a man who was drowning under the weight of responsibility he'd chosen to carry. And in that moment, I understood. I wasn't a burden to him. I was the reason he kept fighting. Every sacrifice he made, every meal he skipped, every night he worked until his body screamed for rest, he did it all because he loved me. Not out of obligation or duty, but out of pure, selfless love. That was what real love looked like. Not the conditional affection my birth parents had offered, where I had to earn their attention by being quiet and convenient. Real love was sacrifice without resentment. It was giving everything you had and never asking for anything in return. I went back to bed that night with tears on my face, understanding for the first time the depth of what Henry had given me. And I made a silent promise that someday, somehow, I would make all his sacrifices worth it. That promise stayed with me as I drifted off to sleep. But hours later, I woke again to a sound that made my blood run cold. Through the thin walls of the mobile home, I could hear Henry coughing violently in his room, the sound harsh and wet and wrong. I lay in bed listening to Henry cough, my heart pounding with worry. The sound went on for what felt like forever before finally subsiding into ragged breathing. I wanted to go to him to check if he was okay, but something held me back. Maybe it was the fear of what I might find. Maybe it was the knowledge that Henry would just tell me he was fine, would put on that brave smile and pretend everything was okay, when it clearly wasn't. The next morning, Henry acted like nothing had happened. He made breakfast, asked about my homework, and drove me to school before heading to the garage. But I couldn't stop thinking about those coughs, about the medical bills I'd found, about the way he'd looked sitting alone in the dark after talking to the bill collector. A few days later, I was playing outside the mobile home when I overheard Mrs. Marlene talking to another neighbor. Mrs. Marlene was an elderly woman who lived 3 trailers down, always kind to me, always waving when she saw us. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but her voice carried in the quiet afternoon air. "It's just so sad," Mrs. Marlene was saying. Henry's heart is too big for this world. First what happened with Evan, and now he's working himself to death for that little girl. The other neighbor said something I couldn't hear, and Mrs. Marlene continued. Oh, you didn't know Henry had a son years ago. Evan was his whole world. But when Henry lost his job and couldn't pay the bills, his wife left him and took the boy. She got a fancy lawyer and convinced the court that Henry couldn't provide a stable home. Henry was devastated. He tried for years to see Evan, but his ex-wife remarried and moved away, changed the boy's last name. Eventually, she just stopped responding to Henry's letters. It broke him. That's why when he found little Taylor abandoned at that garage, he couldn't walk away. He saw it as God giving him another chance to be the father he couldn't be to Evan. I stood frozen behind the trailer, my mind reeling. Evan. Henry had a son. A son he'd lost not because he didn't love him, but because he was poor. Because the system decided that money was more important than a father's love. And when Henry found me abandoned and alone, he'd seen an opportunity for redemption. Everything suddenly made sense. The empty picture frame. The way Henry sometimes looked at me with such intense emotion that it seemed to hurt him. The fierce determination with which he fought to give me everything, even when it meant sacrificing his own health. I wasn't just a child he'd taken in out of kindness. I was his second chance. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Evan, about the son Henry had lost. I wondered what he looked like, whether he knew Henry was still thinking about him, whether he missed his father the way I'd missed having one. And I wondered if Henry looked at me and saw what he'd lost, if every moment with me was both a joy and a reminder of the child who'd been taken from him. Around midnight, I heard movement in the living room. I crept out of bed and peeked around the corner. Henry was standing in front of the wall where the photographs hung, staring at the empty frame beside our picture. The lamp cast long shadows across his face, and in that dim light he looked older than his years, worn down by grief and exhaustion. He reached out and touched the empty frame with one finger so gently it made my chest ache. His lips moved, and though he was speaking too quietly for me to hear the words, I could see his mouth form a name, Evan. I watched as Henry stood there for a long time, just looking at that empty space. I understood now what it represented. It wasn't just an empty frame. It was all the birthdays Henry had missed, all the baseball games he couldn't attend, all the bedtime stories he never got to read, all the moments of his son's life that had been stolen by poverty and a legal system that measured a father's worth in dollars rather than love. When Henry finally went back to his room, I stayed in the hallway for a while, trying to process everything I'd learned. Then I went to Henry's small desk in the corner of the living room where he kept his personal papers. I knew I shouldn't snoop, but I needed to understand. I needed to know more about the man who'd saved me. In the bottom drawer beneath old bills and repair manuals, I found a worn notebook. The pages were yellowed and the handwriting was Henry's, though it looked younger, less steady. I flipped through entries dated years before I was born, before Henry had become the man I knew. Most were mundane notes about work or expenses, but then I found an entry from 8 years ago dated just a few months before Henry found me. The entry was short, just a few lines, but they hit me like a physical blow. It's been 12 years since I lost Evan. 12 years of wondering if he thinks about me, if he knows I never stopped trying. I failed him because I couldn't give him the life he deserved. Sometimes I think that's the worst thing a father can do, love someone with all your heart but not be able to give them what they need. I pray every night that he's happy, that whoever is raising him now is better than I could have been. Maybe someday I'll get another chance. Maybe God will give me a second chance with someone who needs me as much as I need them. Tears blurred my vision as I read those words. Henry had written this before he found me, when he was alone and grieving and believing he'd failed at the most important thing in his life. And then just months later, he'd seen me sitting in that garage, abandoned and scared, and he'd recognized the opportunity for redemption. I closed the notebook carefully and put it back exactly where I'd found it. As I walked back to my room, my mind was spinning with new understanding. Henry hadn't just saved me out of kindness or moral obligation. He'd saved me because he needed to prove to himself that he could be the father he'd always wanted to be. Every sacrifice he made for me, every exhausting double shift, every meal he skipped, every moment of pain he endured in silence. It was all part of his mission to succeed where he believed he'd failed before. I was his redemption, his second chance, his proof that poverty hadn't made him a bad father, that the system had been wrong, that love could be enough even when money wasn't. But as I lay in bed that night, a terrible thought crept into my mind. Did I make him hurt more? Every time Henry looked at me, did he see what he'd lost with Evan? Was I a constant reminder of the son who'd been taken from him? Did loving me mean reopening that wound every single day? I pressed my face into the pillow, overwhelmed by the weight of this new knowledge. Henry had saved me, yes. But maybe I'd saved him too. Or maybe we'd saved each other, two broken people finding wholeness in the space between loss and hope. The question that haunted me as I finally drifted off to sleep was one I couldn't answer. Did I accidentally make him hurt more by reminding him of what he lost? The knowledge of Evan, of Henry's lost son, should have made me more grateful. It should have made me appreciate every sacrifice Henry made, every moment he chose to be my father, when he could have protected himself from the pain of loving another child. But I was 14 years old, and teenagers don't always respond to knowledge with wisdom. Sometimes they respond with guilt, and guilt can twist into anger faster than you'd think possible. High school was brutal in ways I hadn't anticipated. The other kids had known each other since elementary school, had established friend groups and social hierarchies that I didn't understand and couldn't penetrate. I was the outsider, the poor girl who lived in a mobile home park with her foster dad. And teenagers can smell vulnerability like sharks smell blood in water. It started small. Whispers behind hands when I walked down the hallway. Snickers when I pulled out my lunch that Henry had packed in reused grocery bags because we couldn't afford the fancy insulated lunchboxes other kids had. Comments about my clothes, which were clean and neat but obviously secondhand, carrying the faint wear of previous owners. "Nice jeans, Taylor," a girl named Madison said one day, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Are those from this century, or did you find them in your grandpa's closet?" Her friends laughed, and I felt my face burn with humiliation. I wanted to defend Henry, to tell them he wasn't my grandpa, but my father in every way that mattered. But the words stuck in my throat, because part of me, the ugly, ashamed part, agreed with them. Henry was older. He was poor. He couldn't give me the things other kids had. The mocking got worse as the weeks went on. They called Henry my weird old foster dad and made jokes about us living in a trailer park. They speculated loudly about why my real parents had gotten rid of me, creating cruel stories that cut deeper than they knew. Someone started a rumor that Henry wasn't even a real foster parent, that I was just some kid he'd picked up off the street. Every insult about Henry felt like a knife twisting in my chest, not just because they hurt him by proxy, but because I knew the truth about Evan. I knew Henry had already lost one child because poverty made him seem like an inadequate father in the eyes of the law. And here I was, the second chance he'd prayed for, being mocked for the very circumstances he worked himself to exhaustion to overcome. The guilt was crushing. Henry had given up everything for me, and I couldn't even defend him. Worse, I started to resent him. It wasn't fair or logical, but teenage emotions rarely are. I began to think that if Henry just had more money, if he just had a better job, if we just lived in a real house instead of a mobile home, then maybe I wouldn't be the target of so much cruelty. My anger at my classmates transformed into anger at the person who least deserved it. I started acting out in ways I'd never done before. I skipped classes, hiding in the library, or walking around town instead of sitting through another day of whispered insults. I came home late, sometimes hours after school ended, forcing Henry to worry. When he'd ask where I'd been, I'd snap at him. "Why do you care?" I'd say, my voice sharp with misplaced anger. "It's not like you're my real dad anyway." I watched those words hit him like a physical blow, watched the pain flash across his face before he carefully composed himself. And I hated myself for saying it, but I couldn't seem to stop. The anger felt like armor, like if I could just be mad enough, I wouldn't have to feel the shame and guilt and confusion swirling inside me. Henry never yelled back. He never punished me or threatened to send me away. He just absorbed my cruelty with quiet patience, responding with the same steady love he'd always shown. Every night, no matter how late I came home or how badly I'd treated him earlier, there was dinner waiting in the oven still warm with a note that said, "Made your favorite. Hope you had a good day." His patience made me feel worse, not better. I wanted him to fight back to give me a reason to justify my anger. I wanted him to prove that his love was conditional, that eventually I could push him far enough that he'd give up on me like everyone else had. But he wouldn't do it. He just kept loving me through my worst behavior, and that made the guilt even more unbearable. My grades dropped. My attendance became spotty. Finally, the school called Henry in for a meeting with the principal. I sat outside the office, my stomach churning with anxiety and shame, listening through the door as they discussed my future. "Mr. Collins," the principal said, her voice stern, "Taylor's behavior has become unacceptable. We've tried to be understanding, but she's skipping classes, her grades are failing, and other students have complained about her attitude. We're considering expulsion." I held my breath, waiting for Henry to agree with them, to admit that I was too much trouble, that he couldn't handle me anymore. But that's not what happened. "I understand your concerns," Henry said, his voice calm and measured. "And I know Taylor's been struggling, but she's going through a lot right now. Being a teenager is hard, and being a teenager who's experienced what she's experienced is even harder. She's trying to figure out who she is and where she belongs. I'm asking you, please give her another chance. I'm working with her at home. She's a good kid who's just lost her way for a little while. Don't give up on her yet." I pressed my hand over my mouth to stifle the sob that wanted to escape. Even now, even after everything I'd put him through, Henry was defending me. He wasn't making excuses for my behavior, but he was standing up for me, fighting for me to have another opportunity. He believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself. The principal agreed to a probationary period, and I heard Henry thank her profusely before the meeting ended. I quickly moved away from the door, not wanting him to know I'd been listening. On the drive home, Henry didn't lecture me or express disappointment. He just said, "The principal is giving you another chance, Taylor. I hope you'll take it." That night I couldn't sleep. The weight of my own behavior pressed down on me like a physical thing. I'd been so cruel to the one person who'd never been anything but kind to me. I got out of bed around midnight thinking I might apologize, might finally tell Henry how sorry I was for everything. As I walked toward the living room, I saw light coming from under the garage door. Henry sometimes went out there late at night to work on projects, or just to think. I opened the door quietly, intending to talk to him, but what I saw stopped me cold. Henry was sitting on an overturned crate, his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with sobs. In all the years I'd known him, through all the hardship and struggle, I'd never seen him cry like this. The sound was raw and broken, the cry of a man who'd reached the end of his strength. I stood frozen in the doorway, watching the man who'd saved me fall apart, and I knew with horrible certainty that I'd done this to him. I stood in the doorway of the garage, paralyzed by the sight of Henry's breakdown. This man who'd been my rock, who'd faced every hardship with quiet dignity, who'd smiled through his own pain to make sure I felt loved, he was falling apart, and it was my fault. His words whispered into the empty garage like a prayer, cut through me like glass. "I can't lose another child. Please, God, don't let me lose her too." The anguish in his voice was so raw it didn't sound human. It sounded like something being torn apart from the inside. And suddenly, with devastating clarity, I understood what I'd been doing to him. Every cruel word, every late night, every moment of rebellion, I'd been pushing him toward the same cliff edge he'd stood on when he lost Evan. I'd been making him relive his worst nightmare, making him believe he was failing again, that he wasn't enough, that he was going to lose another child he loved. Henry had given me everything. He'd worked himself into exhaustion, sacrificed his health, gone without basic necessities all, so I could have a chance at a normal life. and I'd responded by making him feel like he was losing me, like all his efforts were for nothing. I'd been so consumed by my own shame and anger that I hadn't seen the damage I was causing to the person who least deserved it. Something inside me shattered in that moment. All the armor I'd built up, all the misplaced anger and resentment, all the self-protective walls, they crumbled in an instant. I was left with nothing but the truth. I'd been hurting someone who loved me unconditionally, and if I didn't change right now, I was going to destroy the best thing that had ever happened to me. I stepped into the garage, my own tears streaming down my face. Henry looked up, startled, his eyes red and swollen. For a second, he tried to compose himself, to wipe away the evidence of his pain and put on the brave face he always wore for me. But I didn't let him. I crossed the space between us and wrapped my arms around him, holding him as tightly as I could. "I'm so sorry, Dad," I sobbed into his shoulder. "I'm so sorry." Henry's arms came around me immediately, holding me like I was something precious he'd thought he'd lost. His whole body was shaking, and I realized he was crying too, both of us breaking down together in that dusty garage. "I'm sorry." I kept saying the words, tumbling out between sobs. "I've been so horrible to you. You've done everything for me, and I've been so awful. I don't know why. I don't know what's wrong with me. You're the best thing in my life, and I almost ruined it. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Henry pulled back just enough to look at my face, his hands cupping my cheeks gently. His eyes were filled with tears, but there was no anger in them, no resentment. Just love. Pure, unconditional love. "You don't have to apologize," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're a kid trying to figure out who you are. That's what teenagers do. They push boundaries. They test whether love is real by seeing if they can break it. And Taylor, sweetheart, you could never push me away. Not ever. Do you understand that?" "But I hurt you," I choked out. "I said terrible things. I made you think you were losing me." "You were hurting, so you lashed out. I understand that. I just wish I could have made you see sooner that you don't have to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to prove anything to anyone. I don't need you to be perfect, Taylor. I just need you to let me love you. That's all I've ever needed." We sat together on that garage floor for hours, talking in a way we never had before. I told him about the bullying at school, about the shame I felt living in a mobile home, about how the other kids made me feel like I was less than human. I told him about finding out about Evan, about the guilt that had been eating me alive, about how I'd been afraid that every time he looked at me, he was reminded of what he'd lost. Henry listened to everything without interruption, and when I was done, he spoke with a wisdom that could only come from someone who'd survived real loss. "Taylor, when I look at you, I don't see what I lost. I see what I found. Yes, I lost Evan, and that will hurt until the day I die. But that doesn't mean loving you hurts me. It means you saved me. You gave me a reason to keep going when I'd almost given up. You gave me the chance to be the father I always wanted to be. You're not a reminder of my failure. You're proof that love can win even when everything else is stacked against it." Those words healed something in me I didn't even know was broken. We made promises to each other that night. Henry promised to take better care of himself, to not sacrifice so much that he destroyed his own health. I promised to talk to him when I was struggling instead of lashing out. We promised to be honest with each other, to build something better than what we'd had. The next day, I went to school with a completely different mindset. When Madison made another snide comment about my clothes, I didn't shrink away or feel ashamed. I looked her in the eye and said calmly, "My dad works 2 jobs to give me these clothes. I'm proud of them, and I'm proud of him." She was so shocked by my response that she didn't say anything else, and I realized something important: their cruelty only had power if I let it. Henry had taught me that dignity comes from within, not from what other people think of you. I started paying attention in class again. My grades began to climb. But more importantly, I started thinking about my future in a new way. I wanted to build something meaningful, not just for myself, but for Henry. I wanted to prove that every sacrifice he'd made had been worth it. One afternoon, I stopped by the public library to return some books, and I noticed a bulletin board covered with community announcements. One flyer caught my eye. Free STEM workshop for high school students. Learn basic engineering and problem-solving skills. I took down the information and showed it to Henry that evening. "I want to go to this," I said. "I want to learn something useful, something that could help us someday." Henry's face lit up with pride. "Then we'll make sure you get there. When does it start?" From that point on, Henry drove me to every workshop, every study session, every opportunity I found. He'd wait in the parking lot with a book and a thermos of coffee, using those quiet hours to rest between his two jobs. He never complained about the gas money or the time. He was just grateful to see me engaged and hopeful again. The workshops opened up a world I'd never considered before. I learned about circuits and mechanics, about how things worked, and how to fix them when they broke. But I was particularly drawn to the sessions about computers and basic programming. Something about the logic of code, the way you could build something from nothing with just knowledge and persistence, resonated with me deeply. One day, the librarian who coordinated the workshops approached me as I was leaving. She was a kind woman in her 60s who'd always encouraged my curiosity. "Taylor," she said, handing me a flyer, "I think you might be interested in this. It's a free coding workshop starting next month. They teach you how to build apps and websites. Given how quick you've been picking up the computer skills in our STEM program, I think you'd excel at this." I looked down at the flyer. In bold letters across the top it read, "Free coding workshop. Change your future." Those 4 words felt like a promise, like a doorway opening to possibilities I'd never imagined. I clutched the flyer and smiled at the librarian. "Thank you," I said. "I'll be there." I attended that coding workshop religiously for the next 4 years, absorbing everything I could learn about programming, software development, and app creation. The instructors were volunteers from local tech companies who believed in giving back to the community, and they were patient with my endless questions. I filled notebooks with code snippets and problem-solving strategies, staying up late into the night practicing what I'd learned. But there was one problem: I didn't have a computer at home. I could use the library's computers during my workshop sessions, but I couldn't practice freely or work on my own projects. I tried not to let Henry know how much this limitation frustrated me. He was already doing so much, working himself to exhaustion to keep us afloat. I couldn't ask him for more. Then came my 18th birthday. I woke up to find Henry sitting at our small kitchen table, looking more tired than usual, but with an expression of barely contained excitement. In front of him sat a cardboard box carefully wrapped in newspaper comics because we couldn't afford wrapping paper. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," he said, gesturing to the box. I opened it with trembling hands, and when I saw what was inside, tears immediately filled my eyes. It was a laptop. Not new, the casing was scratched and one corner had a crack sealed with duct tape, but it was real and functional and mine. "Dad," I whispered, my voice breaking, "you didn't have to do this." "I know," he said softly, "but I wanted to. You've been working so hard on your coding, and I could see how much you needed your own computer to practice. It took me a while to save up, but I found a good deal on a refurbished one." What Henry didn't tell me, what I only discovered weeks later when I found the receipts, was that he'd been saving for 8 months. He'd stopped filling his heart medication to afford it. He'd been eating even less than usual, sometimes just crackers and peanut butter for dinner after I'd gone to bed. He'd walked to work instead of driving to save on gas. Every penny that could be spared had gone toward buying me that laptop. When I learned the truth, I confronted him with tears streaming down my face. "You stopped taking your medication for this, Dad. Your heart is fine," he interrupted gently. "And even if it wasn't, seeing you have the tools you need to build your future would be worth it. This laptop is going to change your life, Taylor. I can feel it." He was right. That laptop became my gateway to a new world. I spent every free moment teaching myself to code more sophisticated programs. I watched countless tutorials on YouTube, worked through online courses, joined forums where experienced programmers answered my questions. Henry would fall asleep on the couch to the sound of my typing, and sometimes I'd look over to see him smiling in his sleep, as if even in dreams he was proud of me. After about 6 months of intensive self-teaching, I decided to build something practical, something that would actually help someone. I looked at Henry's garage operation and saw how he struggled with basic organization tracking, which parts he had in inventory scheduling, customer appointments, managing invoices. He did everything on paper, and it was chaotic. I spent 3 months building a simple management app specifically designed for small garage operations. It wasn't fancy or complex, but it worked. It had an inventory tracker that would alert you when parts were running low, a scheduling system that sent reminders about upcoming appointments, and an invoice generator that calculated labor and parts costs automatically. When I showed it to Henry, his eyes went wide with amazement. "You built this whole thing?" "For you," I said, "to make your work easier." Henry started using the app immediately, and within days his entire operation ran more smoothly. He could find parts faster, never forgot appointments, and his invoicing became professional and organized. He was so proud of what I'd built that he showed it to every customer who came through. "My daughter made this," he'd say, his voice full of wonder. "Taught herself how to code and built this whole system. 18 years old and already more talented than most people twice her age." One afternoon about 2 months later, I was helping out at the garage during my summer break from community college when a man in an expensive suit pulled up in a Tesla. He needed a simple oil change, nothing major, and Henry got to work while the man waited in the small customer area. I watched as Henry pulled up the man's appointment on the tablet, running my app, then checked inventory for the right oil filter. The man noticed what Henry was doing and leaned forward with interest. "That's a nice system you have there. Is that a custom app?" Henry's face lit up with pride. "Yes, sir. My daughter built it. She taught herself programming and made this whole thing just for my little garage." The man stood up and walked over to look more closely at the tablet. "May I?" he asked, and Henry handed it to him. The stranger navigated through the app with practiced efficiency, his expression growing more impressed with each screen. "This is remarkably well designed for something custom-built," he said. "Clean interface, intuitive navigation, practical features. Who's your daughter? Is she here?" Henry pointed to where I was organizing parts on the shelf, trying to stay out of the way. "Taylor, come here a second." I walked over, suddenly self-conscious under the stranger's scrutiny. He was older, maybe in his late 50s, with silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through me. "You built this app?" he asked. "Yes, sir," I said. "It's nothing fancy, just something to help my dad with his work." "Nothing fancy." He laughed, but it wasn't mocking. "This is better than some professional management systems I've seen companies pay thousands of dollars for. How long have you been coding?" "About 2 years of serious study," I admitted. "But I'm still learning." The man smiled and extended his hand. "My name is Richard Hawthorne." I shook his hand, the name meaning nothing to me, but I noticed Henry had gone completely still beside me. When I glanced at him, his face had gone pale, his eyes fixed on Richard with an expression I couldn't read, shock, maybe, or recognition, or something deeper. "You," Henry breathed. "I never thought I'd see you again." Richard turned to Henry and his professional demeanor cracked, revealing something raw and emotional underneath. "Henry Collins, I've been trying to find you for years." I looked between them, confused. "You two know each other?" Richard's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Your father saved my life 27 years ago. I owe him everything. My company, my success, my very existence. And I've spent years trying to repay that debt, but he disappeared. Wouldn't take my calls, wouldn't accept my help." Henry shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't save you for payment, Richard. I saved you because it was the right thing to do." "I know." Richard said softly. Which is exactly why you deserved so much better than the life you've had to live. He turned back to me, his expression intense. Taylor, I run a venture capital firm. I invest in tech startups and emerging talent. What you've built here with no formal training and limited resources is extraordinary. With the right guidance and support, you could build something that changes lives. My heart was pounding. This was surreal. A billionaire investor was standing in Henry's garage talking about my future like it was something real and achievable. Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, handing it to me. Then he looked at Henry with an expression full of old grief and new determination. Your father saved my life 27 years ago, Taylor, he said quietly. Now let me help save yours. Richard suggested we talk somewhere more private, and Henry invited him back to our mobile home. The three of us sat around our small kitchen table, and I could feel the weight of history pressing down on the room. Henry looked uncomfortable, almost ashamed, while Richard seemed to be wrestling with emotions he'd kept contained for decades. I need to tell you the whole story, Richard began, his voice heavy. Taylor deserves to know what kind of man raised her, and Henry, you deserve to finally hear what your kindness meant to someone you thought you'd never see again. Henry started to protest, but Richard held up his hand. Please, let me say this. I've waited 27 years. Richard took a deep breath and began. 27 years ago, I was driving on a rainy March morning and I was planning to die. My company had just collapsed under the weight of bad investments and a business partner who'd embezzled everything. My wife had left me a week earlier, taking our 2 children with her. She said she couldn't be married to a failure, that she deserved better than a man who'd lost everything. I was living in my car, drowning in debt with no hope of recovery. I glanced at Henry, who was listening with his eyes closed as if the memory pained him. I wasn't just driving that morning, Richard continued, his voice cracking. I was actively looking for a place to end it. I found a ravine near an old industrial area, and I aimed my car straight for it. I was going to drive right off the edge. But at the last second, my survival instinct kicked in, and I hit the brakes. The car skidded on the wet road and crashed into a ditch instead, rolling twice before coming to rest on its side. Richard's hands trembled as he spoke. I was trapped in the wreckage, bleeding and broken, and I remember thinking that I'd failed even at killing myself. I was crying not from pain, but from the sheer pathetic nature of my existence. And then I heard someone calling out, asking if anyone was in the car. Henry opened his eyes, looking at Richard with deep emotion. I remember. You were pinned under the steering column. You pulled me out in the pouring rain, Richard said, his voice thick with tears. I was sobbing, telling you to leave me there, that I wasn't worth saving. And you know what you said to me. You looked me in the eyes and said your life isn't yours to throw away. Someone out there needs you to stay. I don't know who, and you might not know either, but they're counting on you to keep going. Those words saved my life, Henry. Not pulling me from the car, those words. I felt tears streaming down my own face as I listened. This was why Henry had stopped when everyone else walked past me. This was why he understood abandonment and desperation. He'd seen someone at their lowest point and chosen to believe they still had value. After I recovered in the hospital, Richard continued, I was determined to find you and thank you. But when I went back to that garage, they told me you'd moved on, that you'd taken a job somewhere else. I tried to track you down, but you'd left no forwarding address. It was like you'd vanished. Henry looked down at his weathered hands. I didn't want you to feel obligated, Richard. I didn't save you expecting anything in return. When I heard you'd survived and were getting back on your feet, that was enough for me. I didn't want you to think I'd done it for money or recognition. I know that, Richard said quietly. That's what made me even more determined to find you. I rebuilt my life from absolutely nothing. I took the words you said to me and turned them into a mission. Someone needed me to keep going, so I would keep going. I worked every job I could find, saved every penny, invested in tech startups when they were just beginning. Over the years, I built a venture capital firm worth billions. And every step of the way, I thought about you. about the man who saved a suicidal stranger in the rain and asked for nothing in return. Richard reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder thick with documents. 10 years ago, I finally found you. Or rather, I found where you were. I set up a bank account in your name and deposited money into it not as payment, but as a foundation. I wanted you to have security, to not have to struggle the way I knew you were struggling. I sent letters to your last known address, left messages with the garage where you worked, but you never responded. You never touched the money. He slid the folder across the table to me. Inside were bank statements showing an account with Henry's name on it. My eyes went wide when I saw the balance, $3.8 million. Dad, I whispered, looking at Henry in shock. You knew about this. Henry nodded slowly. Richard found me about 3 years after I took you in. He told me about the account, said I should use it to give you a better life. But I couldn't, Taylor. If I'd taken that money, I would have been teaching you that success comes from luck or connections, not from hard work and integrity. I wanted you to build your own life to earn your own success. Richard pulled out another document, a handwritten letter in Henry's familiar script. He wrote this and gave it to my lawyer years ago with instructions that it should only be opened if something happened to him. I took the letter with shaking hands and read Henry's words. This money is for who she will become, not who I was. Taylor must build her own life, earn her own success, and learn that wealth without character is worthless. Don't give her this money until she's proven she doesn't need it, because that's when she'll be ready to use it wisely. She must build her own life. I looked at Henry through my tears, understanding for the first time the full scope of his sacrifice. He'd known this money existed. He could have used it to ease his pain, to afford his medication, to stop working himself into exhaustion. But he'd chosen poverty and suffering because he believed it would make me stronger. He'd chosen principle over comfort, character over ease. You worked 2 jobs, I said, my voice breaking. You skipped your heart medication. You went hungry, all while this money was sitting there waiting for you. I made the right choice, Henry said firmly. Look at what you've become, Taylor. You're strong, capable, and humble. You built something with your own hands and your own mind. If I'd just given you money, you never would have learned what you're truly capable of. Richard leaned forward, his expression intense. Henry saved me twice. Once from death, and once from a life without purpose. He taught me that how you earn your success matters more than the success itself. And now, Taylor, I want to help you build something extraordinary. Not because you need my money, but because you've already proven you have the talent and character to use it well. He paused, his next words heavy with meaning. But before we talk about your future, I need to tell you something else. Something about what I saw that day 27 years ago. Because Henry's accident wasn't the only thing I witnessed that morning. My blood ran cold as Richard's expression darkened. Now I owe you the truth about what really happened that day. I stared at Richard, my heart pounding. What do you mean, what you saw that day? What else happened? Richard's expression was grave, but before he could answer, Henry reached across the table and took my hand. His grip was firm, grounding me. Richard, maybe we should talk about this another time. This is a lot for Taylor to process already. No, I said firmly, looking between them. I need to know. Whatever it is, tell me now. Richard nodded slowly. I'll tell you everything, but first I need you to understand something about your father's philosophy. Taylor, when Henry set up that account for you, he gave me very specific instructions. He called me about 3 years after you came to live with him, and we had a long conversation about your future. Richard pulled out a small notebook from his briefcase, flipping to a page marked with a worn sticky note. I wrote down what he said word for word because I knew it was important. He told me, if something happens to me, give everything to Taylor, but only when she's ready. Don't let her have it too soon, or it will ruin what I'm trying to teach her. Money is easy to give, character is hard to build. I need her to have character first, then the money will just be a tool she can use wisely. I looked at Henry, who was staring at the table, his jaw tight with emotion. Richard continued reading from his notes. He said, I want Taylor to know what it means to work for something to struggle and overcome. I want her to understand that your worth isn't measured by what's in your bank account, but by how you treat people when you have nothing to gain from them. Every hardship I let her experience now is preparing her to be someone who can handle success without losing herself. That's the real gift I'm giving her, not comfort, but character. The words hit me like a physical blow. Every time Henry had come home exhausted from working 2 jobs, every meal he'd skipped while making sure I had enough every sacrifice I'd witnessed, but not fully understood it had all been intentional. He wasn't just surviving, he was teaching me how to become someone who deserved success. He was playing the long game, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. All those years he was building me into someone strong enough to handle this. Exactly, Richard said. Henry understood something most people never learn, that wealth without character destroys people. He'd watched it happen in his own life when his ex-wife chose money over love, when the courts decided financial stability mattered more than a father's devotion. He didn't want you to become someone who measured worth in dollars. I thought about all the times Henry had gone without. The meals where he claimed he'd already eaten, but I'd never actually seen him eat. The winter when he wore a jacket so thin I could see through it in places, while I had a new warm coat. The medical bills I'd found, the prescriptions he never filled, the appointments he never kept. He could have used Richard's money at any time. He could have taken his heart medication, afforded better food, stopped working himself into exhaustion. But he'd chosen suffering instead. Deliberate, intentional suffering, all so I could learn lessons that money couldn't buy. The magnitude of that love was almost too much to comprehend. Most parents give their children everything they can to make life easier. Henry had done the opposite. He'd made life harder, knowing that difficulty would forge me into someone resilient and strong. Most people will never be loved like that, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Most people will never have someone sacrifice everything, endure years of pain, all to give them something as intangible as character. Henry finally looked up at me, his eyes red with unshed tears. I wanted you to know that you could survive anything. I wanted you to have confidence that came from real achievement, not from luck or inheritance. When you succeed in life, Taylor, I want you to know you earned it through your own merit. That's a gift worth more than any amount of money. I stood up and walked around the table, wrapping my arms around him. You gave me the greatest gift anyone could give. You believed in me enough to let me struggle. You loved me enough to let me build my own strength. We held each other for a long moment, and I felt the weight of everything he'd sacrificed settling into a new understanding. This wasn't tragedy. This was the most profound act of love I could imagine. But Richard cleared his throat, and when I looked at him, his expression had darkened considerably. Taylor, I wish we could sit here and celebrate what Henry built. I wish we could just focus on your future and how to use this money to build your company. But there's a crisis we need to address immediately. Something in his tone made my stomach drop. What kind of crisis? Richard pulled out another folder, this one labeled with legal letterhead. 2 weeks ago, I received notification about a lawsuit that named Henry Collins. I've been trying to find him ever since, which is how I ended up at his garage today. Taylor, your birth parents have filed a lawsuit against Henry's estate. They're claiming he kidnapped you 27 years ago, and that all of the money he intended to leave you is rightfully theirs. The room tilted. I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. What? That's insane. They abandoned me. Henry saved me. I know that, Richard said gently, but they've constructed an elaborate story. They claim they were victims of a misunderstanding, that they temporarily left you in a safe location while they dealt with an emergency, and that Henry took advantage of the situation. They're demanding $3.8 million in damages plus legal fees. They want to destroy Henry's reputation and take everything he built for you. Henry's face had gone pale. When is the trial? It starts in 2 weeks, Richard said. I've already hired the best defense attorneys I know, but Taylor, you need to understand how serious this is. Your birth parents have expensive lawyers and a well-crafted narrative. If they win, they won't just take the money, they'll permanently brand Henry as a kidnapper. Everything he sacrificed, everything he stood for will be twisted into something ugly. I felt like I couldn't breathe. My birth parents. The people who'd left me in that cold garage 27 years ago without looking back. They were coming back now not out of love or regret, but to steal from the man who'd actually raised me, to destroy his legacy and take the money he'd sacrificed everything to build for me. "This can't be happening," I whispered. "After everything he's been through, after everything he's given up, they want to destroy him." Richard's expression was pained. "I'm sorry, Taylor. I wish I could tell you we're going to win this easily, but the truth is they've built a strong case. Without concrete evidence of abandonment, it becomes your word against theirs. And unfortunately, the legal system tends to favor biological parents, especially when they can afford good lawyers." I looked at Henry, seeing the defeat written across his face. He'd fought so hard for so long, and now the people who'd thrown me away were coming back to finish what they'd started, not by taking me, but by taking everything he'd built to protect me. "I'm about to lose everything Dad built," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Everything you sacrificed for. And you're not here to fight with me." But even as I said it, I felt something shift inside me. Henry had spent years teaching me to be strong, to face hardship without breaking. He'd prepared me for exactly this kind of battle, even if he hadn't known the specific form it would take. I looked up at Richard, and he saw the determination in my eyes. "We're going to fight this," Richard said firmly. "My son William is one of the best attorneys in the state. Let me bring him in on this case." Within 2 days, William Hawthorne arrived at Henry's mobile home. He was in his early 30s with his father's sharp intelligence but a warmer demeanor. As he reviewed the lawsuit documents, his expression grew increasingly grim. "This is more calculated than I initially thought," William said. "Your birth parents have hired Preston and Associates, one of the most expensive law firms in the region. They're not playing around." That's when my birth parents requested a meeting. William advised against it, but I insisted. I needed to see them face to face, needed to understand what kind of people would do this to Henry after everything he'd sacrificed. They arrived at Richard's office 3 days later, and I barely recognized them from my fragmented childhood memories. My mother wore an elegant navy suit, pearls at her throat, her hair styled perfectly. My father was equally polished in an expensive charcoal suit. They looked like successful professionals, respectable and refined. The moment they saw me, my mother's eyes filled with tears. She rushed forward and tried to embrace me, her voice breaking with what sounded like genuine emotion. "Taylor. Oh my God. Taylor. My baby girl." I stepped back, avoiding her touch, and I saw a flash of something cold cross her face before the mask of maternal grief returned. "Sweetheart," my father said, his voice thick with emotion. "You can't imagine how long we've searched for you, how many sleepless nights we've spent wondering if you were alive, if you were safe." "Really?" I said, my voice flat. "Because I spent 6 hours sitting on a garage floor waiting for you to come back. You drove away and never looked back." My mother shook her head vigorously, tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face. No, that's not what happened. We were victims of a terrible misunderstanding. We'd left you with a babysitter just for a few minutes while we handled an emergency, and when we came back, you were gone. That man, Henry Collins, he took advantage of the situation. He stole you from us." The lie was so smoothly delivered, so practiced, that I could see how it might convince people who hadn't lived through the truth. But I had lived through it. I remembered the cold, the fear, the certainty that I'd been thrown away. "We searched everywhere," my father continued, pulling out a handkerchief to dab at his eyes. "We filed police reports, hired private investigators, never gave up hope. And then we heard through a mutual acquaintance that you might be alive, that you'd been raised by this man who claimed to have found you. We're just trying to protect you, Taylor, to bring you home where you belong." William stepped forward, his voice professional but cold. "If you'd like to continue this conversation, it should be through legal channels. This meeting is over." After they left, I collapsed into a chair, shaking with rage and disbelief. They're good. They're really good at lying. That's what concerns me, William said. They've had 27 years to perfect this story. Without concrete evidence of abandonment, this becomes a he said, she said situation, and unfortunately, biological parents often have the advantage in these cases. Richard placed a hand on William's shoulder. Then we find the evidence. Dig deeper. There has to be something. William hired the best private investigator in the state, a woman named Sarah Chen, who specialized in uncovering hidden pasts. What she discovered 2 weeks later made me physically ill. William called an emergency meeting and laid out a thick file on the table. Sarah found something, multiple somethings actually. Taylor, your birth parents have a pattern. He opened the file to reveal court documents from 2 different states. In 1985, when they were living in Nevada, they abandoned a 3-year-old boy named Marcus at a shopping mall. The child was found by security, placed in foster care, and eventually adopted. Your parents moved to Arizona and changed their names, slightly, added a middle initial used variations of their first names. My hands started shaking as William continued. In 1988, they abandoned a 5-year-old girl named Rebecca at a bus station in Arizona. Same pattern child found by authorities, placed in foster care, adopted. They moved again, this time to our state. 3 years later, you were born. When you were 8, the pattern repeated. They've done this before, I whispered. I wasn't a mistake. I wasn't an isolated incident. They abandoned children. William nodded grimly. Sarah managed to track down both Marcus and Rebecca. They're adults now with families of their own. Neither wants to testify publicly, the trauma is still too raw, but they've both provided sworn affidavits confirming the pattern. Marcus even has a copy of the original police report from 1985. Why? I asked, my voice breaking. Why would anyone do this repeatedly? Sarah, who'd been sitting quietly in the corner, spoke up. I pulled some sealed psychiatric records from your mother's past. She was diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder in her 20s. Your father shows signs of antisocial personality disorder. Together, they view children as assets or burdens depending on their current circumstances. When money gets tight or life gets hard, they dispose of the burden and start over somewhere new. The horror of it settled over me like a suffocating blanket. I wasn't their daughter. I was never their daughter. I was a temporary convenience that became inconvenient. There's more, William said, his expression darkening. Your parents are currently running for state senate. Their entire campaign is built on family values and personal redemption. They've been telling voters about their long-lost daughter who was taken from them, and how finding her again proves that love conquers all. They need you, Taylor. Not as a daughter, but as a political prop. He pulled out campaign flyers showing my parents' smiling faces above text that read, "Even after losing our daughter for 27 years, we never stopped searching. That's the kind of dedication we'll bring to serving you. If you refuse to play along with their narrative," William continued, "they'll destroy you through this lawsuit. They'll paint Henry as a monster, and you as his brainwashed victim. If you fight them and win, they'll still use the media attention to portray themselves as heartbroken parents wrongly accused. Either way, their campaign benefits. They don't see me as a person," I said, the realization hitting me with devastating clarity. I'm just a commodity to them, something to be used or discarded depending on their needs. William's expression was sympathetic but determined. That's exactly what they are, users. But Taylor, we can beat them. We have evidence of their pattern psychiatric evaluations, witness testimony. We just need to be prepared for them to fight dirty. As if on cue, there was a knock at the door. Richard's assistant entered, her face pale, holding an official-looking envelope. This just arrived by process server. It's addressed to the estate of Henry Collins. William opened it and his jaw tightened as he read. When he looked up at me, I saw genuine anger in his eyes. They've amended the lawsuit. They're now claiming Henry was an alleged kidnapper and manipulator of a minor and demanding $5 million in damages. They've also requested a restraining order preventing you from speaking publicly about the case. I stared at the document where Henry's name appeared in black and white, labeled as a criminal. The man who'd saved me, who'd sacrificed everything to give me a life worth living, was being painted as a monster by the people who'd actually thrown me away. "They're trying to destroy his memory," I said, my voice hollow. "Even death won't protect him from them." The lawsuit became Henry's breaking point. I watched it happen in real time, helpless to stop it. The man who'd survived decades of poverty, who'd worked himself to exhaustion without complaint, who'd endured every hardship with quiet dignity, he couldn't survive being called a kidnapper. The accusation destroyed something fundamental in him. For 27 years, Henry had known in his heart that saving me was the best thing he'd ever done. It was his redemption, his second chance proof that his capacity to love hadn't died with the loss of Evan. But now my birth parents were twisting that act of kindness into something sinister, claiming he'd stolen me, manipulated me, damaged me. I noticed the change immediately. Henry stopped eating much at all. He'd sit at the dinner table pushing food around his plate while staring at nothing. At night I'd hear him pacing in his room, and sometimes I'd catch fragments of him talking to himself, rehearsing defenses that would never be enough. "I just wanted to save her," I heard him whisper one night through his bedroom door. "That's all I ever wanted. Why isn't that enough?" 3 weeks after the amended lawsuit was filed, Henry collapsed at the garage. A customer found him unconscious on the floor, his skin gray, his breathing shallow. The paramedics said it was severe heart failure. His heart had been damaged for years, and the stress had pushed it past the point of recovery. I rode in the ambulance with him, holding his weathered hand, begging him to fight. "Please, Dad, please don't leave me. I need you. I can't do this without you." His eyes fluttered open, and he looked at me with such love and sadness that it broke something inside me. "You can do anything," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I made sure of that." At the hospital, they stabilized him enough for us to talk, though the doctors made it clear his heart was too damaged to recover. Henry knew he was dying. I could see the acceptance in his eyes, the peace that came with knowing his fight was almost over. "Taylor," he said, gesturing weakly toward the notebook on his bedside table. "Need to write something. Help me sit up." With the nurse's help, we propped him up with pillows. His hands shook violently as he tried to hold the pen, and I had to guide his fingers. The writing that emerged was barely legible, but Henry was determined. It took him almost an hour to write what he needed to say, stopping frequently to catch his breath or rest his trembling hand. When he finally finished, he pressed the letter into my palm and closed my fingers around it. "Don't read it yet. After I'm gone. Promise me." "Dad, please. Promise me, Taylor." "I promise," I whispered through my tears. Henry smiled, and for a moment he looked like the man who'd first found me in that garage, strong, kind, certain of his purpose. "I don't regret a single day with you. You were my second chance, and I got it right this time. That's all that matters. Not what anyone else says about it. I know the truth. You know the truth. That's enough." "It's not fair," I sobbed. "You don't deserve this. You saved me. You gave me everything." "I got everything in return," Henry said, his voice growing weaker. 27 years with the best daughter a man could ask for. Most people never get that. I'm the lucky one, sweetheart. His eyes closed and his breathing grew more labored. I held his hand, feeling his pulse grow weaker and weaker. The nurses came in and out, checking monitors, adjusting medication, but we all knew there was nothing more they could do. Henry's heart had carried him as far as it could. That night, at 11:47 p.m., Henry Collins died. His last breath was so gentle I almost didn't realize it had happened. One moment he was there, and the next he was gone. A slight smile on his face, as if he'd finally found the rest he'd been denied his whole life. I sat with him for hours after holding his hand, even though it had grown cold, unable to accept that he was really gone. The man who'd saved me, who'd loved me unconditionally, who'd sacrificed everything to give me a chance at life, he'd been taken by the very people who'd thrown me away in the first place. My birth parents didn't come to the funeral. They didn't send flowers or condolences. Instead, 3 days after Henry's death, they released a public statement through their campaign office. "We've learned of Henry Collins's passing. While this is a tragic end to a complicated situation, we remain committed to seeking justice for the years stolen from our family. We hope his death brings him the peace he clearly needed. The statement was carefully worded to imply guilt without directly accusing, to suggest that Henry had died under the weight of his own conscience. I read it on my phone standing in the funeral home, and the rage that consumed me was so intense I couldn't breathe. William called me that evening. "Taylor, I'm so sorry, but there's something you need to know. Your birth parents filed an amended lawsuit this morning. They're now demanding $5 million and claiming severe emotional distress from being separated from you for decades. They're using Henry's death as evidence that the situation was more traumatic than initially stated. They were using his death, using it as a weapon against the memory of a man who'd never hurt anyone. Henry had worried about becoming a burden, about not being enough, about failing the people he loved. And now, even in death, he was being turned into a villain by people who'd never known a moment of genuine love in their entire lives. The funeral was small. Henry didn't have much family, but the garage's customers came neighbors from the mobile home park people whose lives he'd touched with small acts of kindness. They told stories about Henry fixing their cars for free when they couldn't pay, about him helping them move or watching their kids, or just being there when they needed someone who cared. I stood at his grave after everyone else had left, staring at the simple headstone we'd been able to afford. The injustice of it all was so overwhelming I couldn't even cry. My tears had run dry somewhere between his death and this moment. All that remained was a hollow numbness and a burning rage that had nowhere to go. I pulled out the letter Henry had written in the hospital, my hands shaking as I unfolded the barely legible pages. Through his shaking handwriting, his final message to me emerged, and as I read his words about forgiveness and not seeking revenge, about living for myself instead of against them, I felt my heart break all over again. "I'm sorry, Dad," I whispered to the fresh grave. "But they don't deserve forgiveness. Not after what they're doing to you." A shadow fell across me, and I looked up to see a man in an expensive suit, one of my birth parents' lawyers, someone from the meeting at Richard's office. He looked down at me with cold calculation, no sympathy in his eyes for a woman who'd just buried her father. "Ms. Burke," he said, his voice professionally detached. "My condolences for your loss. The trial begins in 3 weeks. I trust you'll be prepared." He paused, letting the implicit threat hang in the air. "Let's finish what we started." He walked away, leaving me alone with Henry's grave and a fury I could no longer contain. I stood at Henry's grave for a long time after the lawyer left, my hands clenched into fists, trying to channel my rage into something productive. Finally, I turned and walked toward the small group of people still lingering near the funeral home, waiting to offer their condolences. The service had been modest, held in a simple chapel with worn carpet and wooden pews that had seen decades of grief. I'd been worried no one would come, that Henry's quiet life meant he'd be forgotten as quickly as he'd lived. But I was wrong. The chapel had been nearly full-packed with people I'd never met, but who all had stories about the man who'd saved me. A middle-aged man with calloused hands approached me first, introducing himself as Tom Brennan. "Your father fixed my transmission 3 years ago when I just lost my job," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I told him I couldn't pay him right away, and you know what he did? He waved me off and said, 'Pay me when you can. Your family needs that car more than I need the money right now.' I tried to pay him back 6 months later when I got back on my feet, but he wouldn't take full price. Said I'd already paid him by getting through a hard time with my dignity intact." One by one, they came forward with their stories. A woman named Claire told me how Henry had bought groceries for her family when her husband was in the hospital, and they had nothing. He just showed up at our door with bags of food and acted like it was the most normal thing in the world. When I tried to thank him, he said, "That's what neighbors do." An elderly man recounted how Henry had helped him move into a new apartment after his wife passed away, spending his entire Saturday carrying boxes up 3 flights of stairs and refusing to accept any payment. Each story added another layer to my understanding of who Henry had been, not just to me, but to the world. He'd moved through life doing small, quiet kindnesses that he never talked about, never used to elevate himself. He just did them because that's who he was. These people understood what my birth parents never would, that Henry Collins was a man of extraordinary character, disguised in ordinary clothes. He was a hero who never sought recognition, a father who loved without condition, a human being who made the world measurably better simply by existing in it. And now he was being remembered as an alleged kidnapper by people who wanted to use his death for political gain. As the crowd thinned, I noticed Mrs. Marlene standing at a distance, her elderly frame trembling, tears streaming down her weathered face. She'd been our neighbor for years, always kind but quiet, always waving from her porch, but never quite engaging. Now she approached me slowly, as if each step took tremendous courage. "Taylor," she said, her voice breaking, "I need to tell you something I should have said 27 years ago." I guided her to a bench near the cemetery entrance, and we sat together in the late afternoon sun. Mrs. Marlene twisted her hands in her lap, struggling to find the words. "I saw what happened that morning," she finally said. "The morning your parents left you. I was walking to the corner store, and I saw their car parked near that old garage. They were arguing, screaming at each other so loud I could hear them from across the street." My heart started pounding. "You saw them?" Mrs. Marlene nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "Your mother was yelling, 'I can't do this anymore. I can't keep doing this.' And your father was trying to calm her down, but she just kept screaming. Then I saw him open the back door and pull you out. You were crying, confused, asking where you were going. Your father just set you on the curb and said something I couldn't quite hear. Then they both got back in the car and drove away. You stood there for a moment like you couldn't believe what was happening, and then you sat down on the cold ground and waited." The image she painted matched my fragmented memories so perfectly it was painful. "Why didn't you call the police? Why didn't you help me?" "I wanted to," Mrs. Marlene said, her voice desperate with old regret. "God knows I wanted to. But I was 7 months pregnant with my third child, and my husband Roberto, he had a criminal record from when he was young, just some stupid petty theft charges, but they were on his record. We were barely making ends meet, and I was terrified that if I got involved, if I called the police and they started investigating, they might find some reason to cause trouble for Roberto. We couldn't afford that. We couldn't risk it." She grabbed my hands, holding them tightly. "I told myself that someone else would help you, that surely someone would see a little girl sitting alone and do something. When I walked back past the garage an hour later and saw you still there, I almost went to you. But then I saw Henry approach you, saw him kneel down and talk to you, saw him take you to his truck. I recognized him from the garage where Roberto sometimes got work. I knew he was a good man, so I told myself you'd be okay, that Henry would take care of you, and I used that to justify my silence. For 27 years I've lived with the guilt of walking past you that day. I've watched you grow up from a distance, watched Henry work himself to death to give you a good life, and I've never said a word. But now they're calling him a kidnapper, destroying the memory of a man who did what I was too afraid to do. I can't stay silent anymore. I won't." Mrs. Marlene's voice strengthened with resolve. "Let me testify in court about what I saw. Let me tell the truth about how your parents abandoned you and how Henry saved you. Those people are liars, and Henry deserves better than to be remembered as a criminal. He deserves to be remembered as the hero he was." For the first time since Henry died, I felt something other than crushing grief and rage. I felt hope, small and fragile but real. "Will you really do that?" I asked. "Even if their lawyers try to discredit you, even if it's difficult?" "I'm 78 years old," Mrs. Marlene said with a trembling smile. "I don't have much time left, and I don't want to die carrying this guilt. Let me do the right thing, even if it's 27 years too late." I hugged her, this elderly woman who'd carried the weight of her silence for nearly 3 decades and was finally ready to speak. "Thank you. You have no idea what this means." As we stood to leave, I made a silent promise to Henry's grave to the memory of the man who'd given me everything. "I won't let them win, Dad. I'll clear your name. I'll make sure everyone knows you were the best man I've ever known. I promise." Mrs. Marlene squeezed my hand one more time before walking slowly back to her car. I watched her go, feeling the first stirrings of determination cutting through the fog of grief. This fight wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. As I walked toward my own car, my phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from William. "Found something. Come to my office immediately. This changes everything." My hands shook as I read the message. Whatever William had discovered, whatever evidence he'd found, it was significant enough to demand immediate attention. I got in my car and drove toward his office. Henry's final letter folded in my pocket over my heart, and allowed myself to hope that maybe, just maybe, justice was still possible. I arrived at William's office within 20 minutes, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. But before he could show me what he'd found, his assistant rushed in with urgent news. The trial date had been moved up. We had just 3 days to prepare instead of 3 weeks. My birth parents' legal team had argued that the delay was causing their clients undue emotional distress, and the judge had agreed. William's discovery would have to wait. We spent those 3 days in a blur of preparation, reviewing testimony, rehearsing questions, building our defense around Mrs. Marlene's eyewitness account, and the evidence of my parents' pattern of abandonment. But I could see the worry in William's eyes. We were going into battle against one of the most expensive law firms in the state, and we were outgunned. The morning of the trial, the courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the back rows, their cameras and notebooks ready to document every moment. My birth parents sat at the plaintiff's table looking like the picture of respectability, my mother in a conservative dress that screamed concerned parent, my father in a suit that probably cost more than Henry's truck. They'd even brought tissues prepared for their performance. When they took the stand, I watched them transform into grieving parents with the skill of seasoned actors. My mother's voice trembled as she described the terrible morning 27 years ago. "Our car broke down near that garage," she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "We were having mechanical troubles and we pulled over. I told Taylor to wait in the car while we went to find help. We were only gone for maybe 10 minutes, and when we came back, she was gone. Just gone." Her voice broke convincingly, and I saw several jurors lean forward with sympathy. The lie was so smoothly delivered, so detailed, that if I hadn't lived through the truth, I might have believed it myself. My father took over the narrative. "We called the police immediately. We searched everywhere. We filed missing person reports, hired private investigators, never stopped looking. And all that time, Henry Collins had our daughter. He'd taken her, convinced her we'd abandoned her, and turned her against us." Their lawyer stood and presented what he claimed was evidence, a timeline of their search efforts that included dates and locations that sounded plausible but were completely fabricated. He showed therapy records allegedly documenting their PTSD from losing their child, complete with a therapist's signature that I suspected was forged. He even had photographs of them at various search locations over the years, images that could have been taken anywhere at any time, but were presented as proof of their devotion. William objected repeatedly, arguing that the evidence hadn't been properly authenticated, that the timeline didn't match police records, that the therapy records were suspicious. But their lawyer was smooth, always having an answer ready, always making William's objections sound like desperate attempts to hide the truth. The judge, an older man who seemed to favor the polished presentation of the expensive legal team, overruled most of William's objections. I watched the jury's faces and saw sympathy for my birth parents growing with each passing moment. They were winning, rewriting history right in front of everyone, and I was helpless to stop it. Then Mrs. Marlene took the stand. She'd dressed carefully in her Sunday best, her gray hair neatly styled, her hands folded in her lap. When William asked her to describe what she'd seen 27 years ago, her voice was clear and steady. "I saw them abandon that little girl," she said. "I heard the mother screaming that she couldn't do it anymore. I watched the father push Taylor out of the car. They drove away and left her sitting on the cold ground. There was no car breakdown. There was no search for help. They left her there deliberately. For a moment, the courtroom was silent. Mrs. Marlene's testimony was powerful in its simplicity and honesty. But then the opposing lawyer stood for cross-examination, and I watched him systematically destroy her credibility. "Mrs. Marlene," he said with false gentleness, "you're 78 years old, is that correct?" "Yes." "And you're testifying about events you claim to remember from 27 years ago. Tell me, what did you have for breakfast 3 days ago?" Mrs. Marlene hesitated. I'm not sure." "You can't remember what you ate 3 days ago, but you expect this jury to believe you remember precise details from nearly 3 decades ago." He let the question hang in the air. "Mrs. Marlene, isn't it true that your husband Roberto Marlene has a criminal record? That was from when he was young, minor charges. He's been—" "Just answer the question. Yes or no?" "Yes, but—" "And isn't it true that you've lived near Henry Collins for years, that you were friends with him?" "We were neighbors, yes." "So, you had a relationship with the defendant. You lived in the same community. Perhaps you even discussed this case with him before he died." The insinuation was clear. Mrs. Marlene and Henry had conspired to create a false narrative. "No, that's not it, Mrs. Marlene, at your age, with your husband's background, isn't it possible that your memory has been influenced by your sympathy for Taylor? That perhaps you've confused events, mixed up timelines, convinced yourself you saw something that supports the story you want to be true?" By the time the cross-examination ended, Mrs. Marlene was in tears, her testimony shredded by implications and innuendo. The jury looked uncertain now, their earlier sympathy for her replaced with doubt. I wanted to scream that she was telling the truth, that everything she'd said was real, but I could only sit there and watch as our strongest witness was dismantled. That evening, as we regrouped in William's office, the reality of our situation crashed down on me. We had evidence of my parents' past abandonments, but without Marcus and Rebecca willing to testify in person, it was just paper. We had Mrs. Marlene's testimony, but the opposing lawyer had successfully painted her as an unreliable witness with a potential bias. "If we lose this case," I said, my voice hollow, "Henry will be remembered as a kidnapper. Everything he sacrificed, everything he was, will be erased. They'll take his money, they'll take his reputation, and they'll use both to build their political careers." William's expression was grim. "I know. And right now, based on what happened in court today, we're losing." The next morning, before final arguments, the judge called both legal teams into his chambers. When William emerged, his face was pale. "The judge wanted to give us a preliminary indication of his thinking," William said quietly. "Based on the current evidence, he's inclined to rule in favor of the plaintiffs. He thinks their narrative is more credible, that Mrs. Marlene's testimony is too unreliable, and that the evidence of past abandonments isn't directly relevant to this case." My world tilted. We were going to lose. Henry was going to be branded a kidnapper, and the people who'd thrown me away were going to walk away with millions and a political victory. When court resumed, the judge addressed the room. "Based on the evidence presented thus far, I am inclined to rule in favor of the plaintiffs. However, in the interest of thoroughness, we will hear final arguments tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Court is adjourned." I sat frozen as the courtroom emptied around me, feeling the weight of inevitable defeat crushing down on me. Everything Henry had built, everything he'd sacrificed for, was about to be stolen by people who saw me as nothing more than a commodity. William touched my shoulder gently. "It's not over yet. We still have one more day." But I could hear the defeat in his voice. We both knew the truth. We were out of time, out of options, and out of hope. But even as William tried to sound hopeful, I felt the crushing weight of defeat settling over me like a shroud. I left the courthouse and drove aimlessly for hours, unable to face returning to my apartment, where everything reminded me of what I was about to lose. Eventually, without consciously deciding to, I found myself pulling up to Henry's old mobile home. I hadn't been back since his death. The mobile home park looked the same as always, but Henry's home seemed smaller, somehow diminished without his presence. I sat in my car for a long time staring at the small structure that had been my entire world for so many years, remembering all the moments of love and sacrifice that had happened within those thin walls. Finally, I forced myself to get out and unlock the door. The air inside was stale and cold, but underneath it all I could still smell traces of Henry motor oil coffee, and that indefinable scent that was just him. I walked through the tiny living room past the kitchen where he'd made countless meals and into his bedroom. The room was exactly as he'd left it. His bed was made with military precision, a habit from his youth. His work boots sat by the door, still carrying dried mud from the garage. On his nightstand was the book he'd been reading, a bookmark placed 3/4 through marking a story he'd never finish. I sat on the edge of his bed and let myself cry for the first time since the trial started. I'd been holding everything together, trying to be strong, but in this room where Henry had slept and dreamed and planned my future, I could finally let myself fall apart. When my tears finally subsided, I noticed something I'd overlooked before. Under Henry's bed, pushed far back against the wall, was a wooden box. I'd seen it years ago, but had never asked about it, respecting Henry's privacy. Now, with everything at stake, I pulled it out with trembling hands. The box was old, the wood worn smooth by years of handling. It wasn't locked. I opened it slowly, feeling like I was intruding on something sacred. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all in Henry's handwriting spanning years. Some were addressed to me, dated from various points in my childhood, letters he'd written, but never sent, documenting his thoughts and feelings as he'd watched me grow up. Others were addressed to God, raw prayers written in moments of desperation and hope. Several were addressed to Evan, letters to the son he'd lost, words he'd needed to say even knowing they'd never be read. I read through them with tears streaming down my face, each one revealing another layer of the man who'd raised me. But then I found one letter different from the others. It was dated just over a year ago, and it was addressed, "To Taylor, if you ever need the truth." My hands shook as I unfolded it. Henry's familiar handwriting filled the page, though it was less steady than usual, written by hands that were beginning to fail. "My dearest Taylor, if you're reading this, something has happened, and the truth about how we found each other is being questioned. I always knew this day might come. Your birth parents have the kind of pride that can't tolerate being seen as failures, and abandoned children have a way of becoming inconvenient reminders of their worst moments. Richard Hawthorne knows what happened the day I found you. He was there, and he saw more than he's probably told you. But there's one more person who witnessed everything: Thomas Reed, the security guard who worked at Morrison's garage. Thomas saw your parents abandon you. He saw everything. But he was too afraid to speak up at the time. He was undocumented, terrified of being deported if he got involved with the police. I tried for years to convince Thomas to document what he'd seen, to leave some record of the truth. I don't know if he ever did. He died about 10 years ago, but his wife still lives at 347 Maple Street. If you need the truth, start there. Thomas Reed held the missing piece of your story, and I pray he left it behind for you to find. I love you, sweetheart. Fight for the truth, not for revenge. Fight, because Henry Collins deserves to be remembered for who he truly was. Always your father, Henry." I clutched the letter to my chest, a renewed sense of purpose cutting through my despair. Henry had known this might happen. He'd prepared for it, left me breadcrumbs to follow even after death. Thomas Reed, a security guard who'd witnessed everything but had been too afraid to speak. Beneath the letters I found a manila envelope, and inside it was evidence I'd never known existed. Henry had kept meticulous records from the day he found me. There was a copy of the police report he'd filed within hours of finding me, documenting that he'd discovered an abandoned child and was attempting to contact authorities. There were phone logs showing repeated calls to social services, each one marked with notes about being put on hold or transferred or told there was nothing they could do without a missing person report. Most remarkable was a small notebook where Henry had documented everything: the exact time he found me, a description of what I was wearing, the license plate number of my parents' car, that he'd memorized the names of other people who'd been at the garage that morning. He'd tried to do everything right, to follow every legal channel, but the system had failed him at every turn. I realized with devastating clarity that Henry could have walked away. The system had given him every excuse to leave me in its broken hands. But he'd chosen to save me instead, knowing it might come back to haunt him someday. And now, 27 years later, his fears were coming true, but he'd left me the tools to fight back. I grabbed my phone and called Richard, not caring that it was nearly midnight. He answered on the second ring, his voice alert despite the hour. "Taylor, what's wrong?" "I've found something." I said, my words tumbling out. "A letter from Henry. He says there was a security guard at the garage who saw everything, Thomas Reed. Do you know anything about this?" There was a long silence on the other end. When Richard finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Thomas Reed. God, I'd forgotten about him. Yes, he was there that morning. He saw your parents abandon you. I remember him standing at a distance watching. When I went back to the garage weeks later to try to find Henry, Thomas was still working there. I asked him if he remembered seeing a little girl, and he went pale. He told me he'd seen everything but couldn't get involved. Henry says he died 10 years ago, but his wife might still be alive. We need to find her, Richard. If Thomas left any record of what he saw, a statement, a letter, anything, it could save Henry's name." "Henry always believed you'd find your way to the truth," Richard said, and I could hear him moving, getting dressed, preparing for action, even at this late hour. "Thomas Reed's wife, if she's still at the same address, lives at 347 Maple Street. I'll send William there first thing in the morning. If Thomas left any evidence behind, we'll find it." "Meet me there at dawn," I said. "I need to be there when we talk to her." "Taylor," Richard said gently, "this is a long shot. Thomas might not have left anything behind. Don't get your hopes up too high." "It's the only hope I have left," I replied. "And Henry left me this clue for a reason. He believed Thomas might have documented the truth. I have to believe that too." After we hung up, I sat in Henry's bedroom surrounded by his letters and documents, feeling his presence so strongly it was almost like he was there with me. He'd fought for me his entire life, and he was still fighting for me even in death, leaving behind the breadcrumbs I needed to find justice. I looked at the letter again, at Henry's final words, "Fight for the truth, not for revenge." "I will, Dad," I whispered into the empty room. "I promise." My phone buzzed with a text from Richard. "Meet us at dawn. If Thomas left any evidence, we'll find it. Your father deserves justice." I barely slept that night. By 4:30 a.m., I was already dressed and pacing my apartment, waiting for dawn to break. At 5, I drove to 347 Maple Street, arriving before William and Richard. The house was small and well-maintained, with flower boxes in the windows and a tidy garden that showed someone still cared about making beauty in the world. William and Richard pulled up 10 minutes later. Together, the three of us walked to the front door, and I knocked with a hand that trembled despite my best efforts to stay calm. The woman who answered was in her mid-70s with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that held decades of sorrow. The moment I said, "Mrs. Reed, we're here about Thomas Reed and Henry Collins," she pressed her hand to her mouth, and tears immediately began streaming down her face. "Oh, God," she whispered. I've been waiting for someone to come." She ushered us inside to a living room filled with photographs, children, grandchildren, a lifetime of memories. We sat on a worn but comfortable couch while Mrs. Reed settled into a chair across from us, her hands twisting in her lap. "My husband carried the guilt of that day until he died," she began, her voice shaking. "Thomas worked security at Morrison's garage back then. It was just a part-time job under the table because he wasn't documented yet. He was terrified of being deported, of losing everything we'd built." She took a deep breath and continued. "That morning, March 15th, 1998, Thomas saw a couple arrive in an old sedan. They were arguing so loudly he could hear them from inside the security booth. He watched them through the window. The woman was screaming that she couldn't do it anymore, that she was done. The man tried to calm her down, but she just kept screaming. Then Thomas watched as the man opened the back door, pulled a little girl out of the car, and set her on the curb. My throat tightened as Mrs. Reed described the scene I'd lived through but barely remembered. The father said something to the child, but Thomas couldn't hear what. Then both parents got back in the car. Before they drove away, the father looked directly at Thomas. It was a look that said, "You didn't see anything. You say nothing." Thomas told me that look terrified him more than anything. He wanted to help the little girl, but he was so afraid. If he called the police, they might discover he was undocumented. We had 2 babies at home. We couldn't risk it. "When did he tell you this?" William asked gently. "That same day. He came home shaking, told me everything. We agonized over it for days. But then Thomas heard through someone at the garage that Henry Collins had taken the girl in, that she was safe. We told ourselves it was okay that the child was being cared for. We used that to quiet our guilt." Mrs. Reed stood and walked to a closet, pulling out a locked metal box. But Thomas never forgave himself. When he was diagnosed with terminal cancer 10 years ago, he knew he couldn't die carrying that secret. He called a lawyer and a doctor to witness him making this recording. She opened the box with a small key she wore on a chain around her neck. Inside was a cassette tape in a sealed envelope stamped with a notary's seal and dated 10 years prior. "He made me promise to keep this safe, to give it to anyone who ever came asking about that day. He said the truth needed to survive even if he couldn't." With trembling hands, Mrs. Reed placed the cassette into an old tape player. After a moment of static, a weak, raspy voice filled the room, the voice of a dying man unburdening his conscience. "My name is Thomas Reed. I am of sound mind, as witnessed by attorney Martin Chen and Dr. Rebecca Foster, both present at this recording. On the morning of March 15, 1998, while working security at Morrison's garage, I witnessed a man and woman abandon a young girl approximately 8 years old. The mother screamed, "I can't do this anymore, just leave her here." The father removed the child from the vehicle and said, "Someone will find her. Or not." They drove away without looking back. I saw everything. I was too afraid to speak at the time because of my immigration status. This silence has haunted me for 27 years. This is my testimony. This is the truth. I'm sorry I didn't speak sooner. The tape ended and silence filled the room. I was crying, and so was Mrs. Reed. Even William had to clear his throat several times before he could speak. "This is a legally certified deathbed declaration," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's one of the most powerful forms of evidence in any court." Richard leaned forward. "There's something else. I was there that morning, too." He proceeded to tell Mrs. Reed about his own car accident, about seeing the argument and the abandonment just before his crash, about Henry saving him. "I filed a written statement with police after I recovered, but it disappeared into bureaucracy. I kept my copy all these years." Mrs. Reed was weeping openly now. Thomas would be so relieved. He wanted the truth to matter. He wanted it to count for something. William stood carefully, taking possession of the tape and its notarized envelope. He looked at me with something close to fierce joy in his eyes. "We have everything we need," he said. "Tomorrow, we end this." The next morning, the courtroom was even more packed than before. Word had spread that new evidence was being presented, and reporters lined the walls, their cameras focused on every face, every reaction. William began by calling Richard Hawthorne to the stand. The moment Richard was sworn in, the entire energy of the courtroom shifted. Here was a billionaire tech investor, a man of immense wealth and influence, who had absolutely nothing to gain from lying. His testimony was measured, precise, and devastating. He described his own crisis 27 years ago, his planned suicide, and how he'd witnessed a couple violently arguing in their car near Morrison's garage. He testified that he'd seen a child being pushed from the vehicle moments before his own accident. He explained how Henry Collins had saved his life and how he'd tried to report what he'd seen, but had been unconscious for weeks. When he finally recovered and filed a police statement, it had been buried in the system. William presented Richard's original handwritten statement to the police, dated March 1998, describing exactly what he'd witnessed. The document had Richard's signature, a police officer's stamp, and a case number that could be verified. It had existed for 27 years, long before this lawsuit was ever filed. Then William played Thomas Reed's deathbed confession. The courtroom fell into absolute silence as that weak, dying voice filled the space, describing in heartbreaking detail how he'd watched my parents abandon me. Several jurors wiped tears from their eyes. One woman in the jury box had her hand pressed over her mouth, clearly struggling to maintain composure. When the tape ended, I looked at my birth parents. For the first time since the trial began, they looked genuinely afraid. My mother had gone pale, and my father was whispering urgently to their lawyer, who was frantically flipping through papers as if searching for some magic rebuttal. William then presented Henry's meticulous records, the police report he'd filed, the calls to social services, the notebook documenting every detail of finding me. Each piece of evidence painted a picture of a man desperately trying to do the right thing within a system that had failed him at every turn. I felt hope rising in my chest for the first time in days. This was it. We'd done it. The truth was finally being heard, and there was no way my birth parents could talk their way out of this mountain of evidence. But I'd underestimated their willingness to lie. Their lawyer stood abruptly, his face flushed. "Your Honor, if I may, we have a rebuttal witness who can shed important light on these events." My stomach dropped. A rebuttal witness. How could they possibly counter what we'd just presented? A woman in her mid-40s walked into the courtroom. She was well-dressed, composed, and carried herself with the confidence of someone telling the truth. She took the stand and was sworn in. "Please state your name for the record," the opposing lawyer said. "Linda Corso." "Ms. Corso, were you acquainted with Henry Collins in 1998? "Yes, I was. He hired me as a babysitter for a little girl he was caring for temporarily." My blood turned to ice. William shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This witness wasn't disclosed in discovery." "She only came forward yesterday after seeing news coverage of the trial," the opposing lawyer said smoothly. "We had no prior knowledge of her existence." The judge considered for a moment. "I'll allow it, but the defense will have full opportunity for cross-examination. Proceed." Linda Corso launched into an elaborate story. She claimed Henry had hired her to watch me for a few days in April of 1998, promising to pay her $500. But when the time came, he'd only paid her $200, claiming that was all he could afford. Frustrated, she'd contacted my birth parents, whom she claimed to have found through documents Henry carelessly left around his home, and returned me to them. Then a week later, Henry had kidnapped me back. The story was absurd, full of holes, but she told it with such conviction that I watched the jury's certainty begin to waver. Doubt crept back into their faces. How could two people be lying? Maybe there was more complexity to this situation than the simple narrative we'd presented. During the recess that followed, I fell apart in the courthouse hallway. "How can they lie so easily?" I sobbed to William. "That woman is making up complete fiction, and some of those jurors are believing her." William squeezed my shoulder, his expression calm despite the chaos. "Because they're desperate, Taylor. When people are desperate, they make mistakes. They get sloppy. Give me 20 minutes. He walked away with his laptop, his phone pressed to his ear, his fingers flying over the keyboard. I watched him work with furious intensity, calling in what appeared to be every favor he'd ever accumulated. Sarah Chen, our private investigator, appeared and huddled with him, both of them reviewing something on his computer screen. 20 minutes later, we filed back into the courtroom. The judge settled into his seat and addressed William. "Does the defense have any questions for Ms. Corso?" William stood slowly, and I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who knew exactly where the trap was hidden. "Your Honor," William said, his voice carrying clearly through the courtroom, "I have just a few questions that I believe will clarify Ms. Corso's credibility." William approached Linda Corso with the measured calm of a surgeon about to perform a precise operation. He held a folder in his hand, and something about his demeanor made the entire courtroom lean forward with anticipation. Ms. Corso, he began pleasantly, you testified that you babysat Taylor Burke in April of 1998. Can you confirm the specific dates? April 15th through April 22nd? She said confidently, as if she'd rehearsed this detail carefully. And the address where this babysitting took place. Henry Collins' mobile home at 42 Riverside Mobile Park. William nodded thoughtfully. That's very specific, thank you. He opened his folder and pulled out several documents. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence the following items. First, Ms. Linda Corso's criminal record, which shows convictions for fraud in Nevada in 2003 and perjury in Arizona in 2007. Linda Corso's face went white. The opposing lawyer shot to his feet. Objection. This goes directly to the witness's credibility, Your Honor, William interrupted smoothly. The judge gestured for William to continue. Second, William said bank records showing that Ms. Corso received a wire transfer of $50,000 from Patricia Burke Taylor's birth mother exactly 1 week ago. He handed copies to the judge and held one up for the jury to see. The transaction reference note reads, "Consultation fee." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. I watched Linda Corso's confidence crumble in real time. Third, William continued, airline records showing a one-way ticket to Sydney, Australia booked in Ms. Corso's name, departing tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. No return flight. The ticket was purchased the same day she received the $50,000 payment. The implication was devastating. Linda Corso had been paid to lie and given an escape route to a country with no extradition treaty for perjury charges. Finally, William said, his voice hardening, I have the visitor log from Riverside Mobile Park for 1998, according to park management, which kept meticulous records due to security concerns. At the time, the address, 42 Riverside Mobile Park, didn't exist in April 1998. Henry Collins didn't move there until June of that year. Ms. Corso, you claimed to have babysat at an address that wasn't occupied during the time you specified. Linda Corso opened her mouth, closed it, then stammered, I might have gotten the dates confused. Or the address. It was a long time ago. But 3 minutes ago you were very certain about those specific dates and that specific address, William observed. Ms. Corso, how much were you paid to come here and lie? I'm not lying, You received $50,000 from the plaintiff and have a plane ticket out of the country. Your testimony contradicts documented facts. You have prior convictions for perjury. How much of your testimony today was true, Ms. Corso? Any of it? She sat frozen, unable to answer. The judge's expression had turned thunderous. Ms. Corso, the judge said coldly, I'm holding you in contempt of court. Bailiff, please take her into custody. The district attorney will be reviewing potential perjury charges. As Linda Corso was led away in handcuffs, still stammering protests, I felt a surge of fierce satisfaction. But William wasn't finished. Your Honor, he said, given that the opposition's rebuttal witness has been thoroughly discredited, I'd like to request that Thomas Reed's deathbed confession be played one more time without interruption so the jury can hear it in full context. The judge nodded. Granted. This time, when Thomas Reed's dying voice filled the courtroom, there was no counter-narrative to dilute it, no false witness to create doubt. The jury heard every word clearly, the mother's scream, the father's callous indifference, the little girl left behind. I watched tears stream down several jurors' faces. When the tape ended, William called Mrs. Marlene back to the stand. With Thomas Reed's confession supporting every word she said, her testimony took on new weight. She described the same scene from her perspective, her voice strong despite her tears. I saw that little girl abandoned and I did nothing. I've lived with that guilt for 27 years. But I'm telling the truth now. Those people left their child to die or survive on her own. They didn't care which. The opposing lawyer didn't even attempt to cross-examine her this time. What could he say? Every detail she'd provided matched Thomas Reed's account perfectly. That's when my birth mother made her fatal mistake. She'd been watching her carefully constructed lies fall apart, watching her paid witness get arrested, watching the jury's faces turn against her. And she snapped. She shot to her feet, her composure completely shattered. "We gave her a chance to live," she screamed, her voice echoing through the courtroom. "Not everyone can keep a child during hard times. We did what we had to do. We gave her more than other people would have." Her lawyer grabbed her arm, trying to pull her back down, but she yanked away from him. "This was supposed to be simple. We have rights. She came from us," my birth father muttered under his breath. But the courtroom was so silent that the microphone on the plaintiff's table picked up his words clearly. This was supposed to be simple. The judge's gavel came down like thunder. "Order Mrs. Burke sit down immediately, or I will have you removed from this courtroom." My birth mother finally sank into her seat, but the damage was irreversible. She'd just admitted on the record in front of a jury captured by court reporters and cameras that she'd abandoned me because keeping a child during hard times was inconvenient. Her words had stripped away every pretense, every carefully crafted lie. I watched the jury's faces, and what I saw there was not confusion or doubt. It was disgust. They understood now exactly what kind of people sat at the plaintiff's table. These weren't heartbroken parents wrongly accused. They were manipulators who'd gotten caught. The judge removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes, clearly struggling to maintain his professional composure. When he spoke, his voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "This court will recess for 1 hour. When we return, I will deliver my final ruling. Counselors, please remain available." He looked directly at my birth parents, his expression one of pure contempt. "And someone please remind the plaintiffs that any further outbursts will result in removal and additional sanctions." The gavel came down, and the courtroom erupted in noise. That hour felt like the longest of my life. William, Richard, and I sat in a small conference room adjacent to the courtroom, none of us speaking much. There was nothing left to say. We'd presented every piece of evidence, exposed every lie, and now our fate and Henry's legacy rested in the hands of a judge who'd witnessed my birth mother's courtroom meltdown. When the bailiff called us back, my legs felt weak as I walked to my seat. The courtroom was packed again, the reporters sensing that this was the moment everything would be decided. My birth parents sat at their table looking diminished, somehow their expensive lawyer's confidence completely evaporated. The judge entered and we all stood. When he sat and began to speak, his voice carried a weight of moral authority that silenced every whisper in the room. "I have reviewed all evidence presented in this case," he began, "including the deathbed declaration of Thomas Reed, the eyewitness testimony of Richard Hawthorne, the contemporaneous records kept by Henry Collins, the testimony of Marlene Santos, and, perhaps most damningly, the plaintiff's own statements made in this courtroom. The evidence proves beyond any reasonable doubt that on March 15, 1998, the plaintiffs, Patricia and Michael Burke, deliberately abandoned their 8-year-old daughter, Taylor Burke, at Morrison's garage with no intention of returning for her. I heard my birth mother make a small sound of protest, but her lawyer quickly silenced her. "Henry Collins," the judge continued, his voice growing stronger, "acted as a good Samaritan. He found an abandoned child and immediately attempted to contact the proper authorities. When the system failed to respond adequately, Mr. Collins made the difficult but morally correct decision to provide care for this child, rather than leave her to an uncertain fate. Every piece of evidence shows that Mr. Collins acted with the child's best interest at heart, maintaining meticulous records and attempting at every turn to work within the legal system." The judge looked directly at my birth parents, and I'd never seen such contempt in a judicial officer's eyes. "The plaintiff's lawsuit is not only without merit, it is an egregious abuse of the legal system. They have attempted to profit from their own criminal act of child abandonment by painting their victim's savior as a criminal. This court will not allow such perversion of justice." He picked up his gavel, and I held my breath. "The lawsuit is dismissed with prejudice. The plaintiffs are hereby ordered to pay all of the defendant's legal fees and court costs, which I estimate to be substantial given the resources required to defend against these baseless accusations." Additionally, I am imposing sanctions in the amount of $500,000 for bringing a frivolous lawsuit and attempting to suborn perjury through the false testimony of Linda Corso. My birth father's face went ashen. My birth mother looked like she might be sick. Furthermore, the judge said, I am referring this case to the district attorney's office for investigation into potential criminal charges of child abandonment conspiracy to obstruct justice and any other applicable offenses. The evidence suggests a pattern of behavior that extends beyond this single incident, and the people of this state deserve to know if their elected officials engaged in criminal conduct. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice softened just slightly. I want to make a statement for the record regarding Henry Collins. Based on everything I've heard and seen in this courtroom, Henry Collins was not a kidnapper. He was a hero. He saved a child who had been abandoned and gave her a life filled with love and opportunity. His name deserves to be honored, not slandered. This court recognizes his service to Taylor Burke and to basic human decency. May his memory be a blessing to all who knew him. Tears streamed down my face, not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming relief. Henry's name was cleared. After everything they'd tried to do to him, after all their lies and manipulation, the truth had won. My father would be remembered not as a criminal, but as exactly what he was, a good man who did the right thing when everyone else looked away. The gavel came down with finality. This court is adjourned. As I stood to leave, I glanced at my birth parents one last time. They sat frozen at their table, their faces masks of shock and defeat. Their lawyer was already packing his briefcase, clearly eager to distance himself from the disaster this case had become. Outside the courthouse, the scene was chaos. Reporters swarmed my birth parents the moment they emerged, shouting questions about the abandoned children from the 1980s, about Linda Corso, and the $50,000 payment, about their Senate campaign built on lies about family values. I watched from a safe distance as their carefully constructed public image imploded in real time. Someone had already leaked the story to the major news networks. By the time my birth parents reached their car, their phones were ringing constantly, campaign donors pulling support, political allies issuing statements of concern, party officials demanding answers. Within 3 hours, they withdrew from the Senate race, entirely releasing a brief statement about focusing on family during this difficult time. The irony of those words coming from people who'd abandoned 3 children wasn't lost on anyone. I watched it all unfold with a strange detachment. I'd thought that winning would feel triumphant, that seeing them destroyed would bring me satisfaction. But standing there watching their world collapse, I felt nothing except a hollow emptiness. They'd lost everything, yes. But Henry was still gone. Justice had been served, but it couldn't bring him back. It couldn't give me one more conversation, one more hug, one more moment of his quiet wisdom. Revenge didn't heal anything. It just ended things. William appeared at my elbow, having navigated through the crowd of reporters to reach me. His expression was gentle understanding. He'd known all along that winning wouldn't feel the way I'd imagined it would. "Ready to go home?" he asked softly. I nodded, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. Together, we walked away from the courthouse, leaving behind the chaos and the reporters and the people who'd tried to destroy everything Henry had built. We walked toward whatever came next, toward a future I'd have to build, without the man who'd taught me how to stand. William drove me to a secure apartment building on the outskirts of town, one of Richard's properties, where I could avoid the media frenzy that had erupted after the trial. The reporters wanted my story, wanted me to give tearful interviews about justice and redemption, but I had nothing left to give them. I just wanted to be alone. The apartment was beautiful, far nicer than anywhere I'd ever lived. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city. Modern furniture filled the spacious rooms, and the kitchen had appliances I didn't know how to use. But none of it mattered. I would have traded it all for one more night in Henry's cramped mobile home, listening to him move around in the next room. The first few nights were the hardest. The silence was suffocating. I'd grown so accustomed to the sounds of Henry's presence, his soft coughing in the early morning, the clatter of his keys as he came home from work, the creak of the floorboards when he'd check on me before going to bed. Now there was nothing. Just the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic below. I'd won the case. Henry's name was cleared. The people who'd tried to destroy him had lost everything. But sitting alone in that expensive apartment, I realized that justice and healing were two entirely different things. Victory in court couldn't bring Henry back. It couldn't give me one more conversation, one more piece of advice, one more moment of his quiet love. The void he'd left behind was still there, vast and consuming, and no amount of legal vindication could fill it. I surrounded myself with his things. His old work jacket hung on the back of a chair, still smelling faintly of motor oil and the laundry detergent he'd always used. His reading glasses sat on the coffee table beside a book he'd never finish. I kept his favorite coffee mug on the kitchen counter, unable to wash away the ring at the bottom that proved he'd once existed, once drank from it, once been real. Some nights I'd sit on the floor holding that jacket, crying until I had nothing left, allowing myself to finally fully grieve for the man who'd given me everything and asked for nothing in return. William showed up the next morning without calling first. He brought coffee and pastries, set them on the counter, and didn't say anything when he saw my tear-swollen eyes. He just sat down across from me and waited, giving me space to speak or not speak whatever I needed. That became our routine. Every morning, William would arrive with coffee. Sometimes we'd talk about the trial or about Henry or about nothing at all. Sometimes we'd just sit in comfortable silence. He never tried to fix my grief or tell me it would get better soon. He just existed beside me, steady and patient. One afternoon, as we walked through a nearby park, I asked him why he understood so well what I was going through. That's when he told me about his own mother who'd left when he was 7 years old, telling Richard she wasn't meant to be a mother and simply walking away. Richard had raised William alone, working constantly to build his company while trying to be both parents to a heartbroken child. "I used to think everyone would leave eventually," William said, staring at the path ahead. "That anyone who stayed was just waiting for the right moment to go. It took me years to understand that my mother's decision had nothing to do with my worth. Some people just aren't capable of love." I understood then why his presence felt so comfortable. We shared a wound that didn't need explanation, the knowledge of what it felt like to be abandoned by people who were supposed to protect us, and the gratitude of being saved by people who chose to stay. About 2 weeks after the trial, Richard invited me to his office. He'd been giving me space to grieve, only checking in occasionally through William, but now he had something he wanted to discuss. "Taylor," he said, gesturing for me to sit in one of the leather chairs facing his desk. "I have a proposal. Your app, the one you built for Henry's garage, it's brilliant. With proper development and funding, it could help thousands of small businesses like his. I'd like to invest in turning it into something larger. A real company. Your company." I hesitated, old fears rising up. "Richard, I appreciate everything you've done, but Henry worked so hard to teach me independence. If I just take your money—" "Henry didn't raise you to stand alone," Richard interrupted gently. "He raised you to stand strong. There's a difference, Taylor. Strong people know when to accept help. Strong people understand that building something meaningful often requires collaboration. Henry would want you to use every resource available to honor his memory, not to prove you can struggle alone." His words hit me with unexpected force. He was right. Henry had never been too proud to accept help when it was offered honestly. He'd taken the parenting classes, learned from YouTube videos, asked neighbors for advice. What he'd taught me wasn't to reject assistance, but to maintain my integrity regardless of circumstances. "Okay," I said quietly. "Let's build something that would make him proud." Richard smiled, but before he could respond, William entered the office. He looked between us, sensing he'd interrupted something. "Sorry, I didn't mean to intrude. Taylor, when you're finished here, could we talk? There's something my father wants to discuss with you tomorrow. Something important." I looked at William, seeing something in his expression I couldn't quite read. Nervousness, maybe, or anticipation. Whatever Richard wanted to ask me, it clearly mattered a great deal. "Of course," I said. "What time?" The next morning, William picked me up and drove me to Richard's lakeside home. I'd never been there before, and the beauty of it took my breath away. A sprawling house with windows that overlooked still water surrounded by trees that were just beginning to turn autumn colors. Richard met us on the porch, and I noticed immediately that he seemed nervous in a way I'd never seen. This man who commanded boardrooms and made million-dollar decisions with confidence looked uncertain, almost vulnerable. "Taylor," he said, gesturing for me to follow him inside. "There's something I need to ask you. Something I've been thinking about since the trial ended." We sat in his study, a room lined with books and photographs of William at various ages, a visual history of Richard raising his son alone. William excused himself, leaving us in privacy, and Richard took a deep breath before speaking. "I never had a daughter," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "After my wife left, I threw myself into work and raising William. I told myself that was enough, that one child was all I needed. But watching you fight for Henry's memory, seeing your strength and integrity, reminded me what family truly means. It's not about blood. It's about who shows up, who stays, who fights for you when the world turns against you." I felt my throat tighten, sensing where this was going. "Taylor, I'd like to adopt you legally. I want you to become my daughter, to take the Hawthorne name. I can offer you security connections opportunities that—" "Richard," I interrupted gently. "You don't have to. Please let me finish." His eyes were bright with unshed tears. "This isn't about obligation or repaying Henry. This is about the fact that when I look at you, I see someone I'm proud to call family. Someone who embodies every value I tried to teach William. I'm offering you this because I genuinely want you to be my daughter. Everything I have will someday be divided between you and William. You'll never have to worry about money or security again. You'll have the Hawthorne name, which opens doors everywhere. You'll have a father who—" He stopped, realizing what he'd said. A father. But I already had a father, and even death hadn't changed that. I reached across the space between us and took Richard's hand. "Richard, I'm so honored, truly. The fact that you'd want me to be your daughter means more than I can express. But I can't accept." Pain flashed across his face, but he nodded for me to continue. "You saved my father's life 27 years ago," I said carefully, needing him to understand. "Dad used that life you gave him to save me. That's a beautiful circle, your kindness flowing through him to reach me. But if I become your daughter now, if I take your name and your inheritance, that circle loses its meaning. It becomes about me moving up in the world, not about Henry's legacy of love." I paused, gathering my thoughts. Henry Collins wanted me to be Taylor Burke. He wanted me to be the daughter of a poor mechanic who was rich in all the ways that truly matter. He lived in poverty and worked himself to death specifically so I would understand that character is more valuable than wealth, that who you are matters more than what you have. If I change my name to Hawthorne, if I step into a life of wealth and privilege, I'm afraid I'll forget who I am and where I came from. Richard was crying now, tears streaming down his face, but he was also smiling. "Henry didn't save me so I could become someone else," I continued, my own voice breaking. "He saved me so I could become myself. Taylor Burke, daughter of Henry Collins, a man who proved that love doesn't require money or status or anything except a willing heart. That's who I am. That's who I need to stay." Richard pulled me into a hug, and we both cried him for the daughter he couldn't have, me for the father I'd lost. When we finally pulled apart, Richard wiped his eyes and looked at me with something like awe. "Henry taught you something I could never teach William," he said. "Self-respect. The kind that comes from knowing your worth isn't tied to wealth or status. You honor Henry more by keeping his name than I ever could by giving you mine." "But I do want to be part of your family," I said. "Just not as your daughter, as something else. A friend, a partner in honoring Henry's memory, if you're willing." "I'd be honored," Richard said. I'll support you as the mentor, provide capital and guidance for your business, help you build something that makes Henry's sacrifices worthwhile. But I won't try to replace him. He'll always be your father, and I'll always respect that." As I prepared to leave, William was waiting by his car. "How did it go?" he asked. "Your father is an incredible man," I said, "but some things shouldn't be changed even when the alternative seems better." William smiled, understanding immediately what I meant. "Want to take a drive? There's somewhere I'd like to show you." 20 minutes later, we pulled up to Morrison's garage. The building stood empty now, abandoned after the owner had retired. The "For Lease" sign in the window was faded, the parking lot cracked and overgrown with weeds. This was where Henry had found me, where my entire life had changed. We got out of the car and walked toward the building. Memories washed over me, sitting on that cold, concrete floor, watching cars pass by, feeling invisible and forgotten. And then, Henry's shadow falling across me, his gentle voice asking if I was okay. "I've been thinking," William said quietly, standing beside me as we looked at the weathered building. "What if we turned this place into something that honors him? Not a business, but something meaningful. Something that helps people the way Henry helped you." I turned to look at him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, and felt something shift in my chest. This man who barely knew Henry wanted to help preserve his legacy. That meant something. That meant everything. "What did you have in mind?" I asked. William and I stood in front of the empty garage, and I could feel the weight of memory pressing down on me, both painful and precious. This was where everything had begun, where Henry had found a broken child and chosen to save her. "I've never really talked about my mother," William said suddenly, his voice quiet. "Dad knows, of course, but I don't share it with many people. It feels too raw, even after all these years." I turned to look at him, seeing vulnerability in his expression that he usually kept hidden behind professional competence. "She left when I was 7. He continued, staring at the garage as if seeing his own past reflected in its weathered walls. "Just walked out one morning and never came back. She left a note for Dad that said, 'I wasn't meant to be a mother. I'm sorry.' That was it. No explanation, no goodbye to me. She just decided that motherhood was a mistake she needed to correct." "William, I'm so sorry." He shook his head. "The thing is, I spent years thinking I must have done something wrong. That if I'd been a better kid, less needy, less demanding, maybe she would have stayed. It took me a long time to understand that her leaving had nothing to do with my worth and everything to do with her own brokenness." I understood that feeling intimately, the child's belief that they must have somehow deserved abandonment. "Dad raised me alone," William said. "He worked constantly building his company while trying to be both parents. I watched him sacrifice everything to give me stability. And I realized that real love isn't about biology or obligation. It's about showing up. It's about staying when leaving would be easier." He finally looked at me, and I saw my own pain reflected in his eyes. People who've never been left behind don't understand what it does to you. They don't understand why we hold on so tightly to the people who stay, why we build walls to protect ourselves from being abandoned again. But you understand, Taylor. You know what it's like. Standing there with William, I felt seen in a way I hadn't since Henry died. This wasn't attraction born from superficial compatibility or convenient timing. This was recognition, two broken people who understood each other's wounds without needing lengthy explanations. Over the following weeks, we threw ourselves into transforming the garage. Richard helped us secure a lease on the building, and William and I decided to turn it into something meaningful. A small tech studio where I could develop my business combined with a community space that offered free workshops for people who wanted to learn coding and other skills. We did most of the work ourselves. William, despite his wealth, wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. We spent long days cleaning decades of accumulated grime, repairing broken fixtures, painting walls. I'd never seen him in jeans and a t-shirt before, and there was something endearing about watching this polished attorney struggle with a paint roller. We hung photographs of Henry throughout the space images from different periods of his life, many that I'd found in boxes at his mobile home. And we took the empty picture frame, the one that had represented Evan for so many years, and placed inside it the photo from Henry's wall, the one of him and me together, both of us smiling. "He would have loved this," William said, stepping back to admire our work. Seeing his garage transformed into a place that helps people. Working beside William day after day, I discovered layers to him I hadn't known existed. He was funny in unexpected ways, making dry observations that caught me off guard and made me laugh. He listened with genuine attention when I talked about my plans for the business. Our conversations ranged from deep discussions about grief and purpose to comfortable silence while we worked. Love grew between us gradually, like a plant that needs time and care to develop strong roots. It wasn't the passionate, overwhelming romance of movies. It was something quieter, steadier, built on mutual respect and shared understanding. One evening in late autumn, as we were finishing painting the last wall, rain began to fall. We'd left the garage door open for ventilation, and now we stood just inside the opening, watching the storm roll in. The rain came down in sheets and the temperature dropped, bringing with it the smell of wet earth and approaching winter. We stood side by side, tired from the day's work, paint splattered and content. "I never thought I'd feel safe with someone," William said, not looking at me but at the rain. "After my mother left, I built walls so high I didn't think anyone could scale them. I told myself it was better to be alone than to risk being left again." He turned to face me, and in his eyes I saw both vulnerability and certainty. "But I feel safe with you, Taylor. Not because you've promised you'll never leave, but because I know you understand what it costs to stay. You know what it means to choose someone every day the way Henry chose you, the way my father chose me." I reached for his hand and he took it gently, his fingers intertwining with mine. His touch was warm despite the cold air, grounding and real. There was no dramatic declaration of love, no grand romantic gesture. Just two people who'd been broken in similar ways, finding wholeness in each other's presence. The rain fell softly around us, creating a curtain that separated us from the rest of the world. Standing there in the garage where Henry had saved me, holding hands with someone who understood both my grief and my hope, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Not just peace, but possibility. The future didn't seem quite so terrifying anymore. William squeezed my hand gently. "Can I take you somewhere tomorrow? There's a place Dad and I used to go when things felt overwhelming. It's quiet, peaceful. I think you'd like it." I smiled, feeling warmth spread through my chest. "I'd like that." The next day, William took me to a lake about an hour outside the city. It was remote and peaceful, surrounded by pine trees that reflected perfectly in the still water. We sat on the shore for hours, not talking much, just existing together in comfortable silence. That place became our refuge, somewhere we'd go whenever the world felt too heavy. But we also threw ourselves into work. With Richard's investment and William's legal expertise helping navigate the complexities of starting a business, I officially launched Burke Solutions 6 months after the trial ended. The company's first product was a refined version of the app I'd originally built for Henry's Garage, a comprehensive management system designed specifically for small businesses that couldn't afford enterprise software. It tracked inventory, managed scheduling, generated invoices, and included a simple accounting module. But most importantly, it was intuitive enough that people like Henry, who weren't tech-savvy, could use it without extensive training. I priced it affordably and offered a completely free version for businesses with fewer than 5 employees. Henry had always helped people who couldn't pay, and I wanted to honor that philosophy in my own work. The app spread through word of mouth faster than I'd anticipated. A mechanic in Portland tried it and told 3 other garage owners. A small grocery store in Ohio started using it and mentioned it to their suppliers. Within 6 months, we had 50,000 users. Within a year, that number had grown to 500,000. Local newspapers started covering the story, not just the tech angle, but the human one. "Daughter of mechanic revolutionizes small business management," read one headline. Another called me the entrepreneur who hasn't forgotten where she came from. I hired my first employees carefully using criteria Henry had taught me. I didn't care about prestigious degrees or impressive resumes. I cared about character, work ethic, and kindness. During interviews, I'd ask questions designed to reveal how people treated others, how they'd handled conflicts with coworkers, how they responded when someone needed help, what they did when no one was watching. I hired a formerly incarcerated man who'd taught himself coding in prison and had been rejected by dozens of companies despite his obvious talent. I hired a single mother who'd dropped out of college but had a gift for understanding user experience. I hired a military veteran struggling with PTSD who needed flexible hours and patience while he healed. We created a workplace culture built on the values Henry had lived: fairness, respect, second chances, and the belief that everyone deserves dignity regardless of their circumstances. When employees struggled with childcare, with illness, with personal crises, we worked around it instead of replacing them. When someone made a mistake, we treated it as a learning opportunity rather than grounds for punishment. Burke Solutions became profitable not despite these practices, but because of them. Employees who felt valued and respected worked harder, stayed longer, and genuinely cared about our mission. The company wasn't just successful, it was proof that Henry's philosophy could work in the modern business world. As the company grew, media attention increased. A tech magazine ran a profile calling me the Daughter of Kindness, a title that referenced both Henry's character and my business approach. The name stuck. Soon, I was being invited to speak at conferences about ethical business practices, about building company culture, about the importance of second chances. I used the platform to advocate for causes Henry would have cared about: children in foster care, support for struggling families, programs that helped people escape poverty. I donated substantial portions of our profits to organizations that supported abandoned children, and I spoke openly about my own experience to reduce the stigma and shame foster children often carry. Older women in particular seemed to connect with my story. They'd approach me after speeches, sharing their own experiences of loss and perseverance, telling me they were inspired to take risks they'd been too afraid to take before. I became unintentionally a symbol of resilience, proof that pain could be transformed into purpose, that the worst moments of our lives don't have to define our futures. But I never sought fame for its own sake. I shared my story because it was true, because it honored Henry, because maybe it could help someone else who felt abandoned and worthless understand that their past doesn't determine their worth. Through it all, William was beside me, not in front of me or behind me, but beside me. He celebrated my successes without trying to take credit. He supported me through setbacks without trying to fix everything. He became my partner in the truest sense of the word. One evening, about 18 months after we'd launched Burke Solutions, William picked me up from the office. Instead of going to dinner as I'd expected, he drove us to the lake, our lake, the place where we'd first learned to find peace together. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reflected off the water like liquid fire. We walked out onto the old wooden dock and sat with our feet dangling over the edge, just as we'd done dozens of times before. But tonight felt different. William was nervous in a way I'd never seen, fidgeting with his hands, starting to speak, and then stopping, his usual calm confidence replaced by an endearing uncertainty. "Taylor," he finally said, taking my hand in both of his. "My father taught me that success means nothing if you have no one to share it with. He built an empire, but the thing he's most proud of is raising me. Henry taught you that real love is sacrifice, choosing someone else's well-being over your own comfort day after day without keeping score." He turned to face me fully, his eyes intense with emotion. "I want to learn both of those lessons from you for the rest of my life. I want to build something meaningful together, not just a business or a life, but a family. The kind of family built on choice, not obligation. The kind Henry gave you." William reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside was a simple ring, not ostentatious or expensive-looking, but elegant and perfect. But what caught my attention was the small inscription on the inside of the band that I could just barely make out: "Kindness built this." Taylor Burke, William said, his voice shaking slightly. "Will you marry me?" I said yes. Of course I said yes. William slipped the ring onto my finger and we sat on that dock, watching the sun disappear behind the trees, holding each other as the sky darkened and the stars emerged one by one. But before we could build our future together, I needed to complete something I'd been planning since the trial ended. Henry's legacy couldn't just be a successful company bearing my name. It needed to touch lives the way he'd touched mine, directly, personally, transformatively. 6 months before the wedding, I established the Henry Collins Scholarship Fund with an initial endowment of $5 million. The fund provided full educational support, tuition, books, supplies, even living expenses for children who'd been abandoned or orphaned. The first year we awarded scholarships to 50 children. By the third year, that number had grown to 300. But I didn't just write checks. I personally mentored a dozen of the scholarship recipients, meeting with them monthly, attending their school events, showing up at their graduations. I wanted them to know they weren't charity cases. They were investments, just as Henry had invested everything in me. At the Scholarship Fund's launch event, standing before hundreds of donors and supporters, I spoke about the man who'd made it all possible. My father never finished high school. I said, my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm me. He worked with his hands his whole life, never made more than $40,000 in a year, and died with almost nothing in his bank account. But he understood something that many educated, wealthy people never learn: that every child deserves someone who believes in them. This fund is his belief, continuing long after his death. I watched people in the audience wipe tears from their eyes, and I knew many of them were remembering their own Henry Collins, someone who'd seen their potential when no one else did. The second major project was the Collins Village. I purchased the land where Henry's mobile home park had once stood. The park had been sold and demolished 2 years earlier, and built a community of small, dignified homes for struggling families with children. Each home was named after one of Henry's virtues, painted on small plaques beside each door. Kindness House, Patience Home, Hope Shelter, Grace Cottage, Compassion Place. Families could live there rent-free for up to 2 years while they attended job training programs, completed education, or simply got back on their feet after hardship. We provided childcare, counseling services, and connection to community resources. The goal wasn't to create dependency, but to offer the stability people needed to rebuild their lives. At the center of the village, I commissioned a bronze statue of Henry. The sculptor had worked from photographs capturing him in his work clothes, with one hand extended as if to help someone up. The inscription at the base read, "Henry Collins, the man who taught us that kindness never dies." At the dedication ceremony, dozens of Henry's old customers came forward to share stories. A man told how Henry had fixed his car for free when he'd lost his job. A woman recounted how Henry had bought groceries for her family when her husband was ill. Story after story painted a picture of a man who'd moved through the world, leaving trails of quiet kindness wherever he went. But the most meaningful moment came 3 months before the wedding, when William walked into my office with an expression I couldn't read. "I found him," William said simply. "I found Evan." My heart stopped. Henry's son. The boy represented by that empty picture frame for so many years. William's investigators had tracked Evan to a small town in Montana. He was 42 years old, divorced, unemployed, living in a run-down mobile home that reminded me painfully of Henry's old place. When William called him and explained who he was, Evan had broken down on the phone. "My mother told me Dad died in a car accident when I was 12. Evan sobbed when we met him at the airport. "She said he lost control on a rainy night and crashed. I spent 30 years believing he was gone. 30 years. I took Evan to Henry's grave. He collapsed beside the headstone, running his fingers over Henry's name, weeping for the father he'd lost twice, once to divorce, once to a lie. I showed him photographs of the empty picture frame, explained how Henry had kept it on the wall for decades, hoping Evan would come back. "He never stopped loving you," I told Evan. "Every day of his life he thought about you. Every day he hoped you'd find your way back to him." Evan looked at me with eyes that were so much like Henry's it hurt. He saved you when he couldn't save me. He got it right the second time. Help me make sure he continues to save people, I said. The scholarship fund needs a director. Someone who understands what it means to be separated from a parent who loved you. Someone who can help these kids know they're not forgotten. Evan wiped his tears and nodded. Help me make sure our father's kindness outlives us all. Bye. William and I married on a warm June morning by the lake where he'd proposed. We kept the ceremony small and intimate, just the people who truly mattered. Richard officiated, his voice thick with emotion as he spoke about the interconnected nature of love and how Henry's kindness had created ripples that eventually brought William and me together. When it came time to exchange rings, William surprised me. Along with the wedding band, he gave me a pendant, a small piece of metal that had been carefully shaped and polished. "This is from Henry's old truck," he explained, his eyes shining. "The truck he drove to save my father 27 years ago. That moment created everything we have now. Dad's success, your childhood, this moment right here. I wanted you to carry a piece of that with you always." I wore the pendant throughout the ceremony, my hand moving to touch it whenever emotion threatened to overwhelm me. Mrs. Marlene sat in the front row, weeping openly with joy. Evan stood beside me where a father or brother might stand, representing the family Henry had always wanted us to have. The wedding had no elaborate decorations or hundreds of guests, just sincere love and the people who understood what that meant. Burke Solutions continued to grow exponentially, but I made sure we never lost sight of our founding principles. In my office, I kept Henry's old garage chair, the one he'd sat in for years while doing paperwork in his cramped mobile home. Beside it hung a simple wooden plaque that read, "Kindness built this." Every major business decision passed through a single filter. What would Henry do? When we had the resources to expand, we launched free tech training programs in low-income communities, creating pathways for people who'd never had advantages but possessed determination. Our employees didn't just work for a paycheck, they believed in the mission. Burke Solutions became known not just for innovative products, but for ethical practices that proved a company could be both profitable and principled. 1 year after the wedding, I stood in the Collins village on a bright spring morning. The community had come alive in ways that exceeded my hopes. Children played in the central courtyard, their laughter echoing between the small homes. Parents headed off to jobs they'd secured through our training programs, waving goodbye to kids who were safe and cared for. Evan walked up beside me, and together we looked at Henry's bronze statue. A little girl no more than 8 years old with pigtails and a bright yellow dress carefully placed a handful of wildflowers at the statue's base. "Sweetie, do you know who that is?" I asked her gently. She nodded solemnly. "That's Mr. Collins. My mom says he's the man who taught people how to be kind. She says he saved people even though he didn't have much money because kindness doesn't cost anything." Tears filled my eyes. Henry was still teaching, still saving people, still changing lives, even though he'd been gone for nearly 3 years. "He's still doing it," I whispered to Evan. "Even now, he's still saving people." Evan put his arm around my shoulder. "He saved us first, you from abandonment, me from believing I was forgotten. Now we save others. That's how love works. It doesn't end. It multiplies." That evening I drove alone to Henry's grave. I sat on the grass beside his headstone and told him everything about the wedding, about Evan finding his place in the world, about the children being helped by the scholarship fund, about the families rebuilding their lives in the village that bore his name. "People ask me if I got revenge on the people who hurt us, Dad," I said to the quiet stone. "I tell them no. Revenge would have been easy. It would have felt good for a moment and left me empty forever. Instead, I did what you taught me. I turned pain into purpose. I turned loss into legacy." I traced his name carved in the granite, feeling the permanence of it beneath my fingers. My story didn't begin with abandonment, and it didn't end with revenge. It began with your love, and it will end with love too, spreading far beyond anything we could have imagined. Thank you for saving me. Thank you for teaching me. Thank you for showing me that kindness is never, ever wasted. I stood to leave, placing my hand one last time on the headstone. As I walked away, I whispered the truth that had taken me 35 years to fully understand. I'm not the daughter they abandoned. I'm the daughter you chose, and that makes all the difference. If Henry's story touched your heart the way it touched mine, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss stories that remind us what truly matters in life. This isn't just a story about revenge or justice. It's about the quiet heroes who walk among us, the people who choose kindness when the world gives them every reason not to. Henry Collins never became famous, never made headlines, never asked for recognition. But he changed a life completely, and that life went on to change hundreds more. That's the kind of legacy that outlasts any amount of money or fame. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had someone in your life who chose you when they didn't have to? Someone who saw your worth when no one else did? Share your story below. Sometimes we need to be reminded that goodness still exists in this world, and your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Thank you for listening to mine.